Good afternoon. Good afternoon. This is Delegate Maggie McIntosh, Chair of the Appropriations Committee, and I want to welcome all of you to the Appropriations Committee bill hearing this afternoon. However, before we go into the bills, we do have one very large and important bill that we want to hear. And for that, we have, I believe, the Budget Secretary. Yes, we do. And also the Department of Legislative Services here to walk through that bill. And that is the Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act of 2021. Just for the sake of the public, I will tell you that this bill is a bill that accompanies it. It runs along parallel to our budget, and it provides cuts in some instances, or changes to formulas, and other instances are actions that are needed to balance the budget. And so it is treated as a bill that the Appropriations Committee, full committee, not only hears, but we will make decisions about this bill. Believe it or not, I believe beginning next week. So with that, is it, I guess it's, we bring up David Brinkley first, Department of Budget and Management. Is that correct, Michelle?
Yes, that's correct.
All right.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the Appropriations Committee. I presume that you can hear me okay this time. We did a mic check earlier, and is everything working okay?
Yeah. Did you spend more than $40 on that mic check?
Well, we spent $40 on the new microphone. The challenge is that other members have heard this earlier in the mic check is you kind of have to have a little operator. I guess I had to finesse the device to actually turn that microphone on and turn off the one on the laptop, which is why we were distorted before. So I apologize for all that. So
I think, committee, I think that is a nice way of saying it was operator error. That's what
that's exactly right. Exactly right. And when you hear of a plane go down, usually it's pilot error. So it's operator error. So but it's a pleasure to be here. And Madam Chair, just outside of my comments here, you made a good precursor to the whole BRFA concept in that, and I say this in some of my comments later, but the fact is these decisions had to be made before we knew what was coming out of Washington. So let me just transition into our prepared statement here. For the record, I'm David Brinkley, the Secretary of the Department of Budget and Management, and with me today in my office are Deputy Secretary Mark Nicole and Jonathan Martin, the Director of the Office of Budget Analysis. And I appreciate the opportunity, Madam Chair, members of the committee, to respond. Well, we're not really responding to the analysis, although it was distributed earlier. But right now I'm advocating for this Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act. So I'm certainly going to testify in support of the BRFA and try to address any questions that you may have. And as I said yesterday, if we don't have an answer here, we will certainly do our best to get something to you. I've submitted lengthy and detailed written testimony, which I will not read to you. But to begin, I remind you of the challenges we all faced this past year. So when the legislature wrapped up last year's session, none of us knew what the impact this pandemic would have on our state. We knew it wouldn't be good, but we had no idea just how bad it would be. We got our first glimpse into the dire challenges ahead it was last May, when Moody's Analytics predicted a $4 billion shortfall in revenues for the FY21 year, and even more in our out years. In light of that, DBM made recommendations to the governor, and he quickly forwarded many of those recommendations to and for the Board of Public Works to adopt, which certainly helped alleviate some of those challenges early in the new fiscal year. Federal money from the CARES Act played a much more significant role in keeping our economy afloat than anyone could have anticipated. But we still had a significant hole from where we were 2 years ago, which necessitated significant BRFA actions which created $826 million in savings between FY21 and 22 combined, and an additional out-year savings of $1.75 billion in general fund savings through FY26. So let me give you a little bit of the background. When constructing this year's budget, the state found itself in a position we'd never experienced before. Models for revenue projections had been turned on their heads as revenue responded more to the public health crisis than it did to economic pressure. It was quite a roller coaster as prediction after prediction missed their marks, more often to the state's good, and revenue ended up outpacing predictions. But I take note that Maryland is not unique to this fiscal roller coaster ride. Many of us compare this to a sugar high as a result of all the federal stimulus dollars that came into the state for things like unemployment, rental assistance, payroll protection, and other programs that kept people working and our economy from falling apart. So while our economy has not been shattered as predicted, we are living in a time of great uncertainty and unpredictability. As a result, the reliable metrics that our revenue analysts have utilized to closely predict future revenues are no longer as reliable as they used to be. It was in front of this backdrop in September that we began building the state's budget, and the same volatile backdrop existed when we submitted this budget to you on January 20th. So during critical decision making, we had no idea what impact the third wave of cases, which we were in the middle of at that point in time, would have, and we did not know whether there would be another federal stimulus package. Therefore, we felt it would be most fiscally prudent to do a modest budget that recognized all of this uncertainty, ensured critical services in light of what Maryland's families are enduring with this pandemic, and focused on reducing our out-year structural deficit. Frankly, we didn't then, and we still don't know how long certain needs will last. And so in preparing this FY22 budget, and more specifically this BRFA, we needed to address the state's critical and immediate needs while also achieving structural balance. This included providing mandate relief, restructuring repayment of prior fund transfers, authorizing allowable uses of certain funds, making limited changes to statute to facilitate our response to the pandemic, and other changes to current law for short and long-term budget relief. These BRFA actions position the state for any future economic uncertainty and create a structurally balanced budget. And honestly, Madam Chairman, members of the committee, it also gives you, the legislature, the opportunity to do what you need to do too. So this BRFA continues this administration's efforts to enact meaningful mandate relief in both the short and long term. With many mandates, it adjusts future formulas to align with revenue growth, like in the case of the Cade and Selinger formulas, thus giving some predictability to community colleges and non-public higher education facilities for out-year planning purposes. I get they're not happy, but there is certainly a stream of predictability along these lines that we move forward. For the financial consumer protection mandate, we shift the obligation away from the general fund to a special fund that has more than enough revenue and balance to keep this mandate going. In addition to mandate relief, this BRFA directs excess fund balances to the general fund or other specified budget purposes, but, and this is important, maintaining the original intent of those obligations. One of the biggest examples of this is in the redirection of $174.8 million from the marketplace facilitator revenues to the Education Trust Fund to offset shortfalls in the Education Trust Fund. Keeping this administration's commitment and the constitutional requirement to keep the Education Trust Fund in a lockbox. Another action will allow us to use funds from the Blueprint for Maryland's Future Fund to hold harmless counties in FY22, despite declining enrollment as a result of the pandemic. And as you all are aware, those declining enrollments specifically affect the statutory formulas in place, thus spending these funds on their original dedicated purpose, which is education funding. This BRFA provision now has $150 million in funds included in the first supplemental budget to facilitate
I'm good, man. I'm
in-person
so sorry.
classroom.
What, can we do it now? I can hop back on that Zoom link, or I can,
Hey, Lawrence, you're not on mute. Can you mute
Let me
yourself?
reach out to Dr. Golson and see if
Or-
she's available.
or actually, if we could just do it.
Can someone mute Delegate Barnes, please?
Okay, we ready? So this BRFA provision now has $150 million in funds included in the first supplemental budget to facilitate in-person classroom and summer school instruction. That point was so important, I had to repeat it to you. You knew that. In addition to education funding, this BRFA recognizes general fund savings where programs have more than enough in special funds to cover annual costs. The Maryland Health Benefit Exchange is just one example of where this is occurring. On average, the exchange spends $4.7 million less than its annual mandated level. So this BRFA proposes reducing that annual mandate by $3 million, which still leaves a projected surplus, but allowing us to redirect those additional resources to other healthcare related spending. Another example of this is the state reinsurance program, where we swap $100 million in special funds from the program to $100 million in Medicaid funding, reducing general fund spending by $100 million until FY26. The state reinsurance program has more than enough, over $800 million to absorb this cost for the next 6 years, and will still have sufficient resources should something happen. Another item I wanted to highlight for you is the Senior Prescription Drug Assistance Program. This provision will change the priority funding to set a maximum for the Community Health Resources Commission. By setting this ceiling for the CHRC, it will allow more funds to flow into the Senior Prescription Drug Assistance Program, thereby allowing those excess funds to satisfy this growing segment of the budget. And these are just a few of the highlights of what this BRFA attempts to do. We're trying to right-size mandates to align with actual spending, tweaking language to establish priorities in a post-pandemic reality, and we certainly hope that we're entering the post-pandemic phase, but we don't know. Using special funds instead of general funds when those special fund accounts have sufficient balances to cover the difference. And as I mentioned at the very beginning of these examples, trying to ensure funds are spent for their original purposes. Education funding to education funding, healthcare spending for healthcare spending. So Madam Chair, before I conclude my remarks today, there is one more BRFA provision I want to highlight. At the beginning of the pandemic, the state needed cash in order to pay pandemic-related expenses that would eventually be covered by FEMA. For this cash, we would use the local income tax reserve account rather than scarce general funds. These funds have been used for PPE and vaccination efforts. Under this BRFA provision, FEMA reimbursements will then be deposited back into the local income tax reserve account to make sure that it remains whole. This is merely a cash flow function. Any claim denied by FEMA will then be made up by the general fund in the next session. We don't expect that would happen, but we don't know. And all we want is the flexibility. As I said, this is a critical item in the BRFA that I trust you'll keep intact because of this immediate post-pandemic era. We don't know exactly what that's going to look like. And this gives the state flexibility with cash to respond quickly to a crisis of this magnitude. So this concludes my prepared remarks for today. These are just some of the actions I wanted to highlight for you that we took at the beginning of this year to balance the state budget. If we had known then what we know now, some of the provisions in this BRFA would not have been brought forward. But that is why we have offered an amendment to this BRFA to strike the transfer tax provision, which is reflected in our most recently submitted supplemental budget. As amended, this BRFA ensures a balanced FY22 budget, addresses certain aspects of the state's COVID-19 response, and advances the administration's goal of resolving the ongoing structural gap. So I'm certain that I've not covered all the BRFA items that may be of concern. My team and I will attempt to answer your questions, and if we don't have answers now, we certainly will follow up. I appreciate, again, Madam Chair and members of the committee, the opportunity that you've afforded me to address you about this BRFA, and we urge you to vote for a favorable with amendment report on House Bill 589. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I do want to make sure that we give committee members any opportunity to ask questions of the secretary. Do any of you members have a question to the budget secretary before we go to DLS? Seeing none, you must have done a great job. And I do agree with you that doing the budget this year is kind of like a moving target. But that's just the way it is. And we'll get through this. So I want to now call up Dave Romans, Department of Legislative Services, and Tanya Zimmerman, Department of Legislative Services.
Thank you. We have a brief presentation that Tanya is going to put up on the screen. I guess we'll just start by noting if you have any questions about the items that the secretary went through, the fiscal note has a one-page description of each item and a lot of details. There's a lot of good information there if you need further information. Our document is going to focus on DLS recommended changes to the BRFA, new items or changes to existing items. Overall, we're adding about 100 million of options for you in terms of balancing the fiscal 22 budget. And I'm going to turn it over to Tanya, who's going to walk you through the specifics of those items.
Thank you. DLS is recommending 15 provisions. 5 are amendments to the BRFA as introduced. The other 10 are new items. The first recommendation relates to the transfer tax repayment. As introduced, the BRFA would eliminate the fiscal 2022 repayment from the transfer tax and extend the repayment schedule by 1 year. DLS is recommending repealing the repayments in their entirety. The next recommendation, the BRFA as introduced, as mentioned, expands the allowable uses for the Blueprint for Maryland's Future Fund. DLS is recommending further expanding the allowable uses to include those that were included in supplemental budget number 1. For the Care First premium tax exemption, the recommendation is to delay the phase-in of the floor for the senior prescription drug assistance program so that in fiscal 2022, it's 11.5 million before it goes to 14 million. That then would delay the change for the Community Health Resources Commission to make that a cap in fiscal 2023 because it would allow them to have additional funding in fiscal 2022. On the reinsurance program provider assessment, the BRFA is introduced, proposes a $600 million transfer through fiscal 2026. To implement that in practice, you would need a technical amendment to allow the transfer to occur from fund balance as well as new revenue based on the timing and the total amount. It cannot all be new revenue. We're also recommending clarification on who is making the transfer. The final amendment to items as introduced is a recommendation to strike a provision that transfers $500,000 from the Board of Pharmacy fund balance to support costs related to the Office of Controlled Substances Administration in fiscal 2022. The remaining 10 actions are new items. The first is to repeal the final year of the requirement that the budget for the Maryland Transit Administration increased by 4.4% over the fiscal 2021 appropriation. As introduced, the budget does not include the funding to provide this increase, so this conforms that to the budget as introduced. The next two are transfers to the general fund. The first is $5 million from the rate stabilization fund that were identified in the statewide closeout audit as being improperly retained. The second would recognize funds that could have been used in lieu of a CARES Act grant provided to the Charlotte Hall Veterans Home contractor. So it transfers $1 million from the fund to the general fund. The next would be to authorize a transfer of $700,000 from the Board of Psychologists Fund balance to the Behavioral Health Administration for community health services. The remaining recommendations withdraw funding from prior years for a variety of activities. The largest is to delete the fiscal 2021 supplemental retirement payments statewide. That's a reduction of $75 million in total funds, or of which 63 million are general funds. The next reduces the fiscal 2021 spending in the statewide program of DVM that was provided for statewide salary actions, but is unneeded for that purpose. The next item requires a reversion of prior year funding in MSDE. This is an improper encumbrance from a prior year that was also identified in the statewide closeout audit. On the final page here is a recommendation to reduce fiscal 2020 spending for the behavioral health provider reimbursements that are unneeded to pay accruals in that year. It's a total of $5 million. The next is to reduce 16.8 million of fiscal 2021 spending for the developmental disabilities community service to recognize unclaimed enhanced Medicaid match from fiscal 2020. And the final action is to reduce spending in for non-public placements by $7.5 million from fiscal 2020 that were unneeded to pay bills in that year. And that concludes our presentation. There's more detail on each of these items in the remainder of the document.
Okay. Any questions from committee members? Can we go back that budget, the first change you had, which was to, I believe it was transportation?
Yeah, the Maryland Transit Administration.
Yeah. Is this, Delegate Corman, is this where they forgot that they didn't pay attention to the mandate?
Yes, Madam Chair.
And so why would we say, oops, you didn't pay attention to the legislative mandate, fix it so you don't have to? I mean, what's the thinking there? And I'm asking actually DLS.
The reasoning was due to the situation related to COVID, that this would just provide some relief for them as a result of COVID.
Okay. Well, that was a decent answer. Any other questions from the committee? Any questions from the committee? I see none. You guys did an excellent job too. Thank you very much. Thank you. This concludes, oh no, it does not conclude. What am I saying? We have a number of people here to testify on House Bill 589. And I will remind people that we have 2 minutes to give your testimony. And we'll start with Sarah Fiedler from the Maryland Independent Colleges and Universities Association. You here, Sarah?
I'm here. Thank you, Madam Chair.
You're welcome.
So good afternoon, Chair McIntosh, Vice Chair Chang, and members of the Appropriations Committee. As the chairman stated, I'm Sarah Fidler from the Maryland Independent College and University Association. We represent 13 state-aided private nonprofit institutions of higher education, and we serve over 60,000 students. The BRFA eliminates the statutory formula, as you heard Secretary Brinkley say, for the Joseph A. Selinger program, which is a program of aid to independent institutions. It also reduces the appropriation by $29 million. So I'm here to urge you to reject both of these provisions and to fully fund Selinger. The funding formula of the Selinger program ensures that a rising tide lifts all boats. And it was established in the 1970s, and for almost 50 years, the state's investment in our schools has fostered a longstanding partnership among all of the segments of higher education. This link encourages cooperation and collaboration, and by eliminating the link, the BRFA undermines the purpose of the formula. It also disrupts the ability of the General Assembly to establish fiscal budget priorities. Further, it frustrates the intention that funding follow the student at our institutions. So again, I respectfully request that you restore the Selinger program formula. The reduction of the appropriation or level funding comes at a time of financial difficulty for our students, faculty, staff, and communities. On the heels of the reduction of the Board of Public Works in July, we use the vast majority of our Selinger funding for financial aid for our students, Maryland students. And so it's our students who are going to feel this cut most severely. We also use our Selinger funding for workforce development enhancements, career preparation, mentorship, and internship programs and services. So this leads to our nationally touted retention and graduation rates. As you know, it's not just about getting the student in the door of the institution, but making sure that the student persists and graduates. In addition to Selinger funds, we've been very fortunate to receive relief funding from the federal government and also from the governor. However, even with these funds, every one of our institutions has an ongoing gap in financial need, particularly as it's communicated by our students and the financial need that they're experiencing. So we also use institutional-based funds for financial aid, and last year we contributed almost $300 million for this purpose. But with the gap created by COVID, on top of every effort we've made to keep our faculty and staff employed, applying funds in this manner becomes more challenging. So again, respectfully request that you fully fund the Selinger program this year. I've included amendments with my testimony, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions for Sarah? Okay, I see none. Our next witness is Pam Casemeyer. Medkai. Murphy. There we are. Pam.
Hello, Madam Chair, members of the committee. Pam Casemeyer here on behalf of Medkai and Murphy on two different issues, so I'll take a minute for each. The first is relative to the Community Health Resource Commission and the recommendations to reprioritize the Senior Prescription Drug Program and the CHRC for funding. As you have heard from us for many years, the CHRC does incredibly fabulous work, leverages a lot of private and federal money for the grants that they award, and would not like to see the reprioritization, as it would significantly reduce the funding that goes to the commission. This proposal has been included in other BRFAs in previous years, and you have, from our perspective, wisely decided not to make that reprioritization and threaten the work of the commission and the grants that they provide to medically underserved communities for very innovative grant programs. I know that you have a lot of faith in the commission. You've given them funding through the relief fund for various things, and we would like to see their funding continue to be prioritized. On the second issue, shifting quite dramatically to the child welfare system, the BRFA recommends that the child welfare providers get a 4% rate increase for the next fiscal year, but there's a problem with the provision because it ties it to December 31st. You may remember that the Board of Public Works froze the child welfare rates at fiscal year 2020 levels on July 1st. So they essentially worked at last year's rates during this year, even with the pandemic and all the challenges it has posed for them, especially with the COVID. We'd like to see that date changed to January 1. They did get their FY21 rates on January 1. No, it's okay. On January 1, 2021. And so we'd like to see that date increase. The other, or that date changed. The other option would be to have.
Hold on a minute.
The other option would be to have a just a straight across the board 4% rate increase instead of tying it to the fiscal 2021 rates for 1 year while they look and continue with their rate setting changes. And with that, I will take any questions.
Any questions? Ms. Casemeyer? I see none. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. We have Michael Sanderson here with MACO.
Madam Chair, Michael Sanderson has not entered the waiting room.
Okay, how about Rachel Falkner? Rachel Falkner here?
Yes.
Hi, Rachel.
Hi, good afternoon. Madam Chair and members of the committee, Rachel Falkner here with the Licensed Clinical Professional Counselors of Maryland, specifically to address Section 5 of this year's BRFA, which would allow the governor to transfer $2 million of funding from the Board of Professional Counselors and Therapists to the Behavioral Health Administration. While we know that on the surface, this looks like a transfer of funds in a similar area, we would just remind the committee that these are funds paid by licensees to the Board of Professional Counselors and Therapists to then support licensing and regulatory functions for professional counselors. You have a written testimony. I just want to highlight that in 2018, there was a decision from the Attorney General's office that board approved supervisors, so supervisors of graduate level counselors had to be approved by the board and submit an application and be on record with the board. At the time, the board began charging $200 for this function on top of licensing and renewal fees. The professional association asked that the fee not be included because there was a fund balance already, and they went ahead. So now, in the meantime, the board has been trying, it's our understanding, to upgrade their IT systems. And so the fund balance has increased over time. And so there's this large fund balance, and now the licensees are being asked that their money be transferred outside of the board to support the Behavioral Health Administration when we know that there's a need for services and we believe that licensees may be overcharged for services. So with all of those things put together, we would ask that Section 5 be amended out of the BRFA. If that's not possible, we understand the fiscal constraints this year. We would ask that a committee narrative be adopted to have the board look at the licensing fee structure to make sure that revenue and expenditures align and that fees are appropriately structured for licensees to support the board functions, and that a special fund balance of $2.5 million doesn't occur in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions? Okay, I see none. Thank you very much. And I must apologize. I overlooked someone who signed up first, Lori Dole from CBA. Right here.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I am here. Lori Doyle here on behalf of the Community Behavioral Health Association of Maryland to talk about the Community Health Resources Commission BRFA action and to urge that you reject the same. And Ms. Casemeyer did a great job of outlining why we suggest that you reject this BRFA action. I'll just add that the cuts to the CHRC, because their administrative costs are so small, are really cuts to grants, and those grants are to social safety net providers. These are the very services that have been battered by COVID and most in need during the pandemic. So, this session in particular, a lot of focus, and rightfully so, is on health disparities the social determinants of health, and the impact on communities of color and economically disadvantaged communities. And that's exactly the focus of the commission. So this would seem to be a particularly inopportune time to make cuts to their budget. So we ask respectfully that you reject that BRFA language. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions? My apologies, Lori. I didn't mean to overlook you.
That's quite all right. Thank you, Madam Chair.
And now we have Brian from the Maryland Hospital Association. Brian Frazee.
That is another individual we have not seen enter the waiting room.
Okay. Bernie Sandusky is next.
All right, thank you, Madam Chair, for allowing me to testify this afternoon. Just for the record, I'm Bernie Sandusky, Maryland Association of Community Colleges. You have my written testimony. Obviously, we are in opposition to the recommendations in this bill. I just want to make a couple of points. The compounding effects for the fiscal cuts that we've experienced are tremendous. Last year, we lost $36.2 million in the rescission. This year, we're projected to lose to the BRFA another $26 million. If we add all of the rebasing that's taken place since 2008, it's in excess of $140 million that should be in our base aid category. That coupled with a decreasing enrollment, quite frankly, severe enrollment declines presents a fiscal crisis for us. The enrollment, as you know, is a revenue source for us. And this year, we were able to minimize that with some of the federal money. But again, it remains to be seen if we can recapture the enrollment back to our colleges. But from a fiscal standpoint, these are challenging times. The second part of this is that the provisions in the bill would remove us from the formula. Going forward, we absolutely oppose that. So you have my written testimony, and I'll try to answer any questions that you have.
I actually have one, Bernie. I mean, I think it's my view, and it's a view of many, that our community colleges are going to be certainly one of the vehicles that is needed to not only give relief to the pandemic, but to repair and completely lift us out of what the effects of the pandemic have been on employment. You know, I'm from Baltimore, and the Baltimore area has relied heavily on tourism and our hotels and our tourist industry has suffered greatly. At one point, I was in touch with the hotel workers where they reported to me that during the pandemic, the height of it, that 90% of their employees were unemployed, had been unemployed, 90%. So, and I do believe, and this is getting to the question, I do believe that many of those jobs are not going to come back. And, you know, many restaurants have closed permanently. I do think tourism, although it's coming back, will be slow to come back. So have you at the Community College Association begun to think about how and what role the community colleges can play in actually getting our economy back on track and retraining workers who have lost their jobs?
So 2 points. Number one, you're exactly right. And if you read the latest information research coming out of Georgetown Center on Workforce and Education, it points to that. It says many of the jobs will not be coming back. That's one. And people are going to have to be reskilled. The second point, many of the people who lost those jobs are our students. Making enough money to take a course now and then to get a credential. We are positioned well. We need a mass marketing campaign that we're planning for to say the future is through us. You can do this. You need some counseling to do it, and we can tell you the path towards what the jobs that are being indicated for the new economy. It is our goal. We say we are the economic engine, primarily because a good portion of what we do is workforce development. So this is nothing new. We have talked about this internally. The question is, how do we get the word out that people have no choice but to get back, to get reskilled? And that's the challenge. And that's what we're dealing with right now.
All right, and last but not least, this isn't a question, but a request, Bernie. If you could get to me what your formula is, how the money is distributed between all of the community college campuses, both operating and capital, how you make those decisions, I would appreciate it. And I thank you for being here. Thank you.
I will absolutely send that to you. Yep.
Thank you very much. Okay, next is Laura Bogley.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the committee. My name is Laura Bogley and I represent Maryland Right to Life. On behalf of our members across the state, we strongly oppose HB 589 because it forces Maryland taxpayers to fund abortion providers and deprives the people our natural and constitutional rights to life, liberty, freedom of speech, and religion. This bill mandates an annual $100 million in taxpayer funding to reimburse medical care providers. This includes at least 3 state programs that fund abortion providers. The Medical Assistance Program is the primary vehicle for Medicaid reimbursements to abortion providers. In 2019, Maryland taxpayers paid more than $6 million for more than 9,660 abortions, none of which were to save the life of the mother. When the Supreme Court of the United States declared abortion legal, overturning the lawfully enacted laws of 46 states, including Maryland, they promised us that abortion would be safe, legal, and rare. But as long as the state continues to entrust those who stand to profit from the sale of abortions with the education and care of women and children, abortion will be neither safe nor rare. In their annual report, Planned Parenthood reports that the abortion business is thriving and that in the last year, they committed 354,871 abortions, nearly an all-time high. In stark contrast, Planned Parenthood's prenatal services and adoption referrals have dropped by double digits. Yet the state continues to force Maryland taxpayers to compensate abortion providers under the guise of family planning. The state is failing Maryland women and children. Legal abortion has reached epidemic proportions and is the leading killer of Black lives more than gun violence and all other causes of death combined. The majority of women do not choose abortion, but feel they have no other choice because the state is not investing in real solutions. Women and families deserve better than abortion, and public funds should be prioritized for programs that save the lives of both mothers and children, which has bipartisan support. For these reasons, we respectfully urge you to uphold your oath of office to protect the constitutional rights of all human beings, both born and preborn. And we thank you for your time today.
Thank you. Any questions? Okay, thank you very much. We're now going to move to Nicholas Cohen, Maryland Citizens for the Arts.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Mr. Vice Chair, honorable members of the committee. My name is Nicholas Cohen. I'm the Executive Director of Maryland Citizens for the Arts. We're the nonprofit organization that serves as a statewide advocacy group for public investment in the arts. I'm here today to provide a voice for thousands of extremely concerned arts constituents. To that end, I respectfully ask that lawmakers reject the governor's proposed alteration of the Maryland State Arts Council funding formula found in the 21 BRFA. This funding cut would reach at least $5.6 million by fiscal year 26 and result in an almost $24 million cut across the next 5 fiscal years. This would be a devastating blow for the Maryland arts economy and potentially lead to massive layoffs and a prolonged and stifled economic recovery. The current State Arts Council funding formula is considered a national model in terms of arts legislation. Passed in '94 as the Art Stabilization Act, it has helped create an equitable source of funding that shifted capital away from just a few arts organizations and instead helped create the current funding structure deployed by the State Arts Council, which now provides investment for over 300 arts organizations, 24 county arts councils, thousands of independent artists, and numerous arts education programs across Maryland. To change a successful and critical source of investment in the middle of a health and economic crisis would be akin to shutting off a fire hose when a building was burning to the ground. It simply doesn't make any fiscal sense. Much as the hospitality and restaurant sectors have been suffering massive losses due to COVID-19, arts organizations and artists have also been financially decimated across the state due to the closures of almost all arts-related activities and venues since March of last year. The economic challenges suffered from this once-in-a-generation pandemic have been significant and widespread. The arts industry has never before seen such a massive economic decline, and that downturn within the sector is significantly more extensive and incredibly more devastating than the Great Recession of 2008. So now is not the time for disinvestment. So instead, I ask the committee to continue their steadfast support of the arts and reject the governor's proposed funding formula change and fully fund the Maryland State Arts Council at $27.3 million. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions? Then you're right about the historic nature of this funding formula. I actually was in an earlier conversation with Nick. I'm not going to go into it now or today, some other time, but I was a mere freshman on this Appropriations Committee when the great late Pete Rollins got this 1% through for the arts. And you're absolutely correct that it has stood us in good stead, and the arts community, in addition to the hospitality community, has been greatly impacted by this pandemic. So I was remiss from not including you. Any questions? Seeing none, I have James Ball from Carroll Community College.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For some reason, I am unable to get my video running, and I don't know why it was earlier. At least you're not seeing the image of a cat as I'm talking. I am Jim Ball, president of Carroll Community College. Thank you for having me here to testify today. I think that the Bernie Sadusky offered a lot of the comments that I would make in terms of the loss of revenue that we've endured over the years from BRFA funding reductions. And in particular, last year was a tough year for community colleges because we lost that $36.5 million in revenue that we were slated to get and had planned to be able to give a long overdue salary increase at Carroll Community College. That meant a loss of $1 million to us. And so we were unable to give any increase last year and have been able to give only minimal increases for quite a while now. So that element is difficult for us, losing that $25 million in appropriations for next year. We note that there's a 5.5% increase left in that formula. We're not saying that we don't want that. We're objecting to that, but certainly on the heels of the loss from last year, in addition to what Bernie mentioned about our loss in student enrollment this year, because people are, I think, making decisions to take gap years and that sort of thing, and the attendance is down probably in the neighborhood right now of about 9.5% across the state for community colleges. And we'd have a lot of making up to do there. We do, in terms of your questions, stand poised to be on that road to recovery for Maryland. We're right in the square in the middle of that road. And we know that we've been working with our strategic plan for MAC to factor that in. We've held focus groups with Secretary of Labor, Secretary of Higher Education, and others from business and industry around the state. And we're listening to their needs, and we're trying to put together our plan, especially for next year, to address some of that employment development need. Certainly, we are engaged right now in much of the in-demand training and education for first responders, for nurses, for allied health professionals, for cybersecurity professionals, and all that list goes on for us. So we note and all of us are planning strategically to address that need in Maryland. So we just need the funding to be able to do this. We've endured a lot of cuts over the years, and we urge that Maryland community colleges are seen as for our role in helping to increase Maryland's access to workforce development.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Any questions? Well, thank you very much for being here. Allison Taylor is next.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
I have my yellow hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry. Delegate McKay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This question was for Mr. Sandusky.
Okay.
And so, Mr. Burnett, there is a bill in our committee that has to do with collective bargaining and talking about the affording of community college. Are we going to still be able to be having affordable community college if a bill on collective bargaining actually passes?
Well, it'll determine on what the bill would look like. We've made a number of recommendations in earlier testimony about the bill itself. Right now, as the bill is written, it's very problematically fiscal from a fiscal standpoint for community colleges. Again, the bill has not passed. We are concerned with the bill. We continue to try to work with both the House and the Senate on amending the bill that would make it more of a workable bill. From a fiscal standpoint, the way it's written currently, we've opposed the bill.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? Any questions? I see none. We do have two witnesses that I called that were stuck in the Senate. They are here now. I am going to let them testify, give their 2 minutes. Michael Sanderson, are you here?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I greatly appreciate the flexibility. I'm Michael Sanderson with the Maryland Association of Counties. Committee members, we've submitted written testimony on a handful of things in this broad bill. I'll speak to them briefly. I think we would attach ourselves to comments you've heard from community colleges. I would just say, as sort of a structure of government argument that deals with that, as a practical matter, a budget reconciliation bill to manage this year's budget or the immediate timetable ahead of you, I think makes sense. Making a permanent reversal of a long-term policy that came from years of work on funding for an entity like community colleges and saying we're just going to set it aside as part of a one-year budget reconciliation bill, I think takes the authority out of your hands in all candor. So we generally oppose those long-term decisions and rebasings and would do so here. I want to speak to a couple issues that are specific to county governments. One proposal in the reconciliation bill before you would shift additional administrative costs of the State Department of Assessments and Taxation onto county governments. I could dig up and quote chapter and verse from your legislative staff advising against this shift on policy grounds from year after year of different budget analyses. We think it's a bad idea. Our prior testimony said things about foxes and hen houses and so forth, but as a practical matter, Maryland does this right. A centralized system with employees who are central and run by and managed by the state is better than having this a dispersed local system. A new twist in this year's BRFA bill is assigning costs for erroneous convictions to county governments. I guess philosophically, the idea was to hold some accountability for state's attorneys, but that's not what this does. This ends up being the taxpayers of county governments would bear the share of a shifted cost. And this is actually, as I call, retroactive. I'm sorry if there's been earlier testimony or amendments on this, but as a practical matter, you're not addressing the entity who has anything to do with the process of the duties of the state's attorney, who are independent elected officials. Just shifting those costs onto county governments, it's not smart budgeting. It's just a paper trick. And finally, I'll reference school funding issues. One of the elements in the reconciliation bill is an obligation for counties to hold harmless school funding for this year in order to receive state hold harmless funding. It sounds like this is going to be addressed in a future bill, and the DLS budget analysis alludes to that. I just want to say, because the second leg of that stool is in the BRFA bill, you need all three legs of that stool. The idea of covering for this year's drop in enrollment with some funding this year at the state level makes sense. Holding the counties to a hold harmless this year can make sense, as long as this doesn't bite them in the backside next year under the way maintenance of effort works. So don't build that into the base and create a disincentive for folks to take the carrot, because you want everybody to do the right thing this year. Fix that in probably the other bill and everything should be fine. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sanderson. Are there any questions from members of the committee to Mr. Sanderson? Seeing none, we have next Mr. Brian Frazee with the Maryland Hospital Association. Mr. Frazee, thanks for being here.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. And I too appreciate the flexibility of the committee. Good afternoon, everyone. For the record, my name is Brian Frazee, and I'm here on behalf of the Maryland Hospital Association in support of the BRFA with amendments. Maryland's hospitals urge the Maryland General Assembly to reject Governor Hogan's proposed $35 million increase in the Medicaid deficit assessment. You all may recall that in 2015, when the assessment had ballooned to nearly $400 million, Governor Hogan and the General Assembly committed to reducing the assessment by a certain dollar amount each year. And reducing the assessment yields multiple benefits for individual Marylanders as well as the state. It lessens the financial burden on hospital patients because the assessment adds about 2% to every hospital bill in Maryland. And it also artificially inflates our healthcare spending, which puts additional pressure on the state's ability to meet the cost-saving requirements of our total cost of care agreement with the federal government. Last session, the General Assembly decided to freeze the Medicaid deficit assessment at its fiscal year 2021 level indefinitely. Increasing the assessment for the first time in over 5 years would take away the significant progress that you all have made on this issue over the past several years. And so for those reasons, we hope that you all will decide to amend the BRFA to keep the assessment at its current level as was agreed to last year. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Frazee. And we have a question from the chairman of the Health and Social Services Subcommittee, Delegate Resnick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Frazee, just a quick question. With the implementation of the reinsurance program a few years ago, it has been my understanding that the cost of healthcare in the state of Maryland has been going down. Is that not correct?
Thank you for that question, Delegate. I do believe that that is correct, that healthcare spending has been helped by that issue for sure.
Okay, so because over the years, and I know that you and I have spoken about the Medicaid deficit assessment a number of times, where you talk about how it adds costs to the system. And though we have not made any real progress in lowering the deficit down from where it was a few years ago, the cost of healthcare continues to drop. Is that not correct?
I would have to go back and look at the specific numbers, Delegate, that you're referencing. I think we're certainly moving in the right direction with the work that you all have done, as well as the total cost of care model requires us to meet certain targets. I think what I'm saying in my testimony and on this issue, and like you said, we've talked about this many times over the years, that it really just artificially inflates our healthcare spending in Maryland. And so any reduction that you all do on this will help that further, in addition to the issues that you've been referencing. And I want to be clear too, that we're actually not asking for a reduction. We're just asking that you all keep it where it is right now, just as was agreed to last year. We would be happy with that progress.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Are there any other questions from members of the House Appropriations Committee for Mr. Frazee? Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Frazee, for being here. Next, we'll hear testimony from Ms. Allison Taylor, Kaiser Permanente.
Good afternoon, Mr. Vice Chair and members of the committee. As you mentioned, my name is Allison Taylor, and I'm here on behalf of Kaiser Permanente. We wanted to raise two concerns that we have with the BRFA. The first is the substantial transfer of money from the state reinsurance program to Medicaid every fiscal year between now and fiscal 26. The state reinsurance program has been extremely effective, as was just discussed by Delegate Resnick, at reducing health insurance costs for individuals in the individual market, and has actually helped to increase enrollment in that market because premiums have been brought down. This proposal, as noted by DLS, would at a minimum need a technical fix because the reinsurance program is slated to sunset in 2023, and this would propose to go all the way through 2026. However, it's a long time horizon for this type of transfer out of a program that's been so successful. So we would ask the committee to proceed with caution in making a transfer of this size. We would also note that it's an open question to us whether the Medicaid program would be able to get a federal match from these funds transferred from reinsurance to Medicaid, so it may not be the most efficient use of our resources to proceed with that. The second issue I want to raise is the BRFA does propose a $3 million annual cut to the operating budget of the Maryland Health Benefit Exchange. The exchange has indicated that this cut would come out of their call center, which is used to help individuals enroll in Medicaid, but also in individual and small group coverage. There's been a lot more interest in enrolling in these products, or maybe not interest, but greater need in enrolling in them as individuals are losing coverage through because losing employment during COVID and that sort of thing. So there's, as we see it, an increased need for the services provided by the exchange, and think it's not a prudent time to cut their operating budget. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Taylor. Are there any questions from members of the House Appropriations Committee for Ms. Taylor? Seeing none, thank you very much, Ms. Taylor, for being here. That concludes the bill hearing for House Bill 589, the Budget Reconciliation and Finance Act of 2021. Next, the committee will move on to House Bill 937, which is sponsored by the chairwoman of the House Appropriations Committee, Delegate Maggie McIntosh, State Lottery Fund, Maryland Humanities College Funding. On behalf of Chairwoman Maggie McIntosh, we have presenting the bill, Ms. Dana Phillips, who is Chief of Staff. Ms. Phillips, please proceed when you're ready.
Thank you, Vice Chair and the members of the Appropriation Committee. As the Vice Chair stated, my name is Dana Phillips, and I'm the Appropriations Committee's Chief of Staff, and I'm glad to be here presenting this testimony on behalf of Chairwoman McIntosh. I'm pleased to present today House Bill 937, titled State Lottery Fund, Maryland Humanities Council Funding. This bill defines funding sources for an annual grant of $150,000 to the Maryland Humanities Council as stipulated in previous legislation. This bill requires the comptroller to produce the funds from the State Lottery Fund. This original bill, introduced in 2016, stipulated funding for 2 years beginning in FY18. The update in 2018 made this funding perpetual, and the financing just didn't name the source, and it passed unanimously in both chambers in each year that it has been considered. The Maryland Humanities Council is an educational nonprofit serving communities in all 23 counties and Baltimore City every year. This funding is a significant asset to the Humanities Council. The council offers 10 virtual and in-person programs that are diverse and inclusive and help connect individuals to endless resources and instruction. One example is the Museum on Main Street program. The Smithsonian Institute and MOMS collaborate, bringing a traveling exhibition committed to bringing humanities programs, historical societies, and cultural revenues to discover new information for students to explore Maryland's historical background. Maryland Humanities also provides grants to other nonprofits in support of projects with a humanities focus. Today, you will hear from several individuals who will speak to the significance and need for this funding. You will listen to testimony from Ms. Lindsay Baker, the Maryland Humanities Executive Director, as well as hear from Mr. Matthew who will speak to his experience as a student in the humanities' largest and longest running program, Maryland History Day. We will also be able to read testimony from Janet Clark Green, a Prince George's County teacher and special educations director. Ms. Clark speaks to the significance these programs have directly on students and how much value and encouragement the council offers young people while supporting their efforts to explore and become involved in literature and historical activities. I urge you to vote in favor of this bill because of the substantial impact the council programs have on not just Maryland students, but residents of all ages.
Great. Thank you very much, Madam Chief of Staff Phillips, for presenting House Bill 937. And we do have questions from members of the Appropriations Committee for Madam Chief of Staff. So great being here. Thank you so much for being here, Madam Chief of Staff. So are there, all right, the hands keep coming. So you did a great job. Wonderful, wonderful.
I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, all right. So thank you very much, Madam Chief of Staff. We
Thank
do
you.
have witnesses here who are here to support the bill, and if they could both present their testimony and limit to 2 minutes, please. We have Matthew Palatnik with the Maryland Humanities and also Lindsay Baker with the Maryland Humanities. Please proceed when you're ready.
Sure, I will go first. Thank you, delegates and Ms. Phillips. Good afternoon. I'm Lindsay Baker, the Executive Director of Maryland Humanities, and I thank Chairwoman McIntosh and the members of the committee for hearing me in support of House Bill 937 and the Chairwoman for her sponsorship of it. I have been a partner to and fan of Maryland Humanities for many years before joining this organization this past summer. I've long found their work to have an abiding impact on communities throughout the state, and I'm privileged to now lead them. This bill would update existing legislation to clarify the source of an annual grant that has proven vital for the continued high level of service that is Maryland Humanities custom. Maryland Humanities was very fortunate to be included in the original 2016 legislation, which provided $150,000 annually for 2 years, FY18 and FY19, to support our service to Marylanders via our programming, including Maryland History Day. During the 2018 session, new legislation was passed, striking the end date for the funding. It was clear that the will of the General Assembly was to provide this funding on a stable and permanent basis as the bill passed unanimously in both chambers. However, in early FY20, an issue with language in the legislation meant the state could not legally dispense the grant as directed. Working with Secretary Brinkley and his team at DBM, a solution was found for FY20. Governor Hogan then generously included the $150,000 in a separate annual grant using monies from the general fund received via the Maryland Historical Trust and the Department of Planning for FY21 and proposed the same for FY22. We have recently been assured that Governor Hogan will include it in our grant for FY23, which is great. Through this bill, we simply seek to have the funding for this annual grant specified and insured for the long term. This funding has been critical to our ability to meet the needs of those we serve, both youth and adults. Maryland Humanities programming consistently reaches more than 250,000 Marylanders statewide, including this year in 2020 in the pandemic. We offered more than 1,000 events last year, both in-person and virtual, with direct participation by more than 83,000 and an additional audience of 192,000, thanks to grant-supported events and mass communications. We have been able to accelerate our program service thanks to the enhanced resources offered by this $150,000 grant received each year since FY18. And I'm going to keep to 2 minutes, and I will conclude that and just say thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Baker. And is Matthew Palatnik here with Maryland?
Yes, I am. Can you all see me?
Yes, we can. Please proceed when you're ready. 2 minutes, please. Thank you, sir.
Excellent. Good afternoon. Thank you to the committee for this opportunity to speak to you in support of Maryland Humanities. Let me introduce myself. My name is Matthew Palatnik, a graduate of Poolesville High School and 3-time Maryland History Day winner. In the fall, I will matriculate at the University of Cambridge to study history. What I learned by competing in National History Day was instrumental to my education. My work for NHD served as part of my application to Cambridge. I was required to share 2 pieces of historical research, both of which were NHD projects. One was a paper on urban planning innovator Jane Jacobs, and the other a website about Julius Rosenwald. the philanthropist and advocate for African American education. The conducting of primary source research, the backbone of History Day, is a vital preparation for my education at Cambridge. I not only learned about history through Maryland Humanities programs, however, I also learned how to think. Young people today come of age in an era dominated by misinformation in which facts have, for many, become indistinguishable from lies. The two most important tactics in combating this crisis of truth are the ability to understand information, its origin, its reliability, and how it fits into context, and the constructing of a narrative to not only establish fact, but to combat deception directly. Maryland Humanities not only teaches tens of thousands of students across Maryland academic subjects, but also information literacy skills vital in their success as informed citizens of our democratic society. Students take the skills they learn in Maryland Humanities programs not only in the form of an appreciation for history, literature, and culture, but also in the form of intellectual rigor and informed discussion they might not otherwise receive. To safeguard this funding is not only important to the study of the humanities in our state, it is important to the future of citizenship in Maryland. For these reasons, I respectfully request a favorable report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Plotnick, and good luck to your future. Are there any questions from members of the House Appropriations Committee for Mr. Plotnick or Ms. Baker? Seeing none, thank you very much. And again, thank you, Madam Chief of Staff Phillips, for presenting this bill. And we also want to thank you for all your work for the Appropriations Committee, especially during this unprecedented session. So thank you very much, Madam Chief of Staff.
Thank you.
Okay, next we will move on to two bills that will also be presented to three members from the Health and Government Operations Committee who are joining us today. They are Delegates Rosenberg, Delegate Hill, and Delegate Krebs. We want to thank them for coming over to join us today on the next two bills. And the first bill is House Bill 1091, Delegate Resnick, Emergency and Expedited Procurement Reforms.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to members of Appropriations and to my colleagues from HGO for joining us here today. I find it interesting that Delegate Rosenberg and I appear to be on the same wavelength on several bills this session. So kudos to those of us who oversee procurement in the state. House Bill 1081 is, in my opinion, a very critical bill. It is, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what it does first, and then we can go into the justification and the background further. The bill does a few things. First, it strengthens the definition of what constitutes an emergency when it comes to our state's public procurement. Emergency procurements will then have to be approved by the Chief Procurement Officer within 48 hours of a request. The Chief Procurement Officer does not form the decision. He just simply needs to approve the request as made. Board of Public Works then has the approval requirement for anything over $1 million going forward. Within 60 days, after the end of the fiscal year, each primary procurement unit needs to submit a procurement report to the CPO about what they've done. And then it also grants state procurement units the ability to do an expedited procurement rather than an emergency procurement, which is currently reserved for only two Maryland departments, the Maryland Aviation Administration and the Maryland Port Commission. So why is this necessary? Before I go into that, let me explain very quickly. And many of you know this already, in my professional life, when I'm not here in the legislature, I am a government procurement professional. I work as somebody who bids on, implements, and oversees compliance for federal contracts. And in fact, currently in my current professional role, I do this for the one office in our federal government whose job it is to respond to emergencies all over the world. And that's man-made or natural disaster emergencies. So I work every day with people whose job it is not to just respond to a plumbing leak or an electrical malfunction, but literally having to get food, shelter, and medical supplies halfway around the world in a moment's notice after a hurricane or an earthquake. So I understand the purpose and need for emergency procurement as well as anyone. But what we have seen in the state this year, especially with COVID, is that we have a very few guardrails when it comes to authorizing and allowing emergency procurements under the nature of an emergency. And in fact, two particularly egregious issues that emerged this year came as a result of, or as an excuse for, with the COVID pandemic. The first, as you all may recall, was Blue Flame Medical, where at the beginning of the pandemic, the administration ran to contract with this company $12.5 million to provide PPEs and ventilators. This is a company that was literally formed a few weeks before we placed this order. And we got this order because one of the owners of the company was a former political operative who had a friend in the administration. They had no background in doing this work. They had no history. They had no corporate capabilities, as we call it in the industry. But we paid them $12.5 million, and they failed to deliver. Now, thankfully, eventually they did deliver, but by then, where was the emergency? The second one was the procurement, $9.5 million that the governor procured from Lab Genomics in South Korea for COVID testing kits. What we later discovered was that we couldn't use them right away anyway. So again, no emergency, because they were missing valuable components. When we finally got the valuable components, we realized that the tests were fraught with problems and were delivering false positives and couldn't even work. And ultimately, we had to pay several million more dollars to Lab Genomics to swap those test kits out for functional test kits. Again, no real emergency, and yet we completely bypassed the procurement process in the state. We cannot do this any longer. We have to put in guardrails to allow for our procurement professionals, all of whom were bypassed in these two particular instances, and frankly, from what I understand, in many more, in every sense of the way. They were all bypassed. We blew through all the rules on procurement just so that we could get these products under the guise of emergency, when in fact there was no actual emergency in terms of being able to get the products themselves. Obviously, COVID itself was an emergency. So all we are asking under this bill is that we slow down just a tad, just a little bit. 48 hours to be able to get notices in place and let people look over the issue, to allow for at least oral bids to be gathered by procurement professionals, so that we are not wasting taxpayer money on things that should not be deemed an emergency. Now, before you also in the system is an amendment, a proposed sponsor amendment that sets the minimum threshold at $1 million. So we're not talking about, there's a plumbing leak somewhere and we have to go out and get bolts because we ran out of bolts, right? We're talking about $1 million to require for a review of the procurement before the money is spent. So the amendment you can see there. It is critical that we get this in place. And I want to provide to you a couple of statistics because I think it's important. And I know that a lot of the departments that are coming afterwards to testify against this are going to say this is going to delay emergencies. If we're going to have an emergency that we need to deal with, and, if there is a pipe burst in a prison and our inmates are suddenly, walking around in sewer water, we need to get somebody in there right away. I don't disagree. However, we should know enough in advance. We should be prepared in advance for these kinds of eventualities. Plumbing issues, electrical issues, these are not emergencies in the sense of we have no idea what to do. These are emergencies in the sense of we need to have a plumber on contract ready to come in and deal with the issue. So here's a little surprise, and this is not specifically just with COVID, because if you look back over the last 8 years, contracts that have been deemed an emergency, meaning they needed to be awarded within 48 hours, most 70% of those awards took place after 48 hours, but were deemed an emergency. 79% took 3 or more days. 68% of those took 7 or more days. And 25% of them, 1/4 of what we've contracted as an emergency, actually took 30 or more days to execute. So what we have been doing in our state in the procurement system is we have been using the term emergency as an excuse to get around procurement rules. And we cannot have that going on any further. Now, we did offer a sponsor amendment. It does create a minimum threshold. I understand that specifically Department of Public Safety has some further concerns. I'm open to additional amendments, but I think we finally need to put some guardrails on our procurement system, especially with regard to emergency procurements, to make sure we're not wasting taxpayers' money and that we are following the rules. Because if we use the term emergency every time we just want to get around the rules, then there's no point in having a public procurement system. So I want to thank you all for your time. I'm open to any questions, and I will urge a favorable report.
Thank you very much, Delegate Resnick, for presenting House Bill 1091. Are there any questions from members of the committee? Delegate Krim.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'd like to thank Delegate Resnick for the bill and ask him if he did review the evaluation report from Mr. Powell's office as part of the joint Audit and Evaluation Committee, the Evaluation Department's report of the emergency procurement.
I have not had a chance to review that report. I do apologize, but I would love to take the opportunity to do so.
Okay, I'm happy to forward that to your office. They do make several recommendations, and also they also provided some legislation that we did not move forward this year. But you know, if your bill has those issues in them, I think we should move them forward. The recommendations, the first one was the state's chief procurement officer should submit a thorough report on all emergency contracts annually to the General Assembly. You agree with that?
That is in the bill, yes.
That's in the bill. There
That's
we
in
go.
the bill.
All off to a good start.
Yes.
The Maryland General Assembly should enact legislation that requires the state's chief procurement officer to pre-approve every emergency procurement.
I don't know if it has every emergency procurement, but with the amendment, it does include the bottom is $1 million.
Okay, well, that, yeah, so, okay, so, but that's in there.
Yeah.
The statute.
With the amendment.
Okay. The statutory and regulatory definition of emergency in the context of procurement should be modified to improve clarity and consistency in its use.
So actually, I'm getting a note right now, Prim. This bill I'm cross-filing with Senator Lamb on the Senate side.
Okay.
I get a note. His office is the one that drafted it, and I just got a note from his staff saying that this bill actually tracks that report.
So, okay, so you have everything in your bill.
It should, yes.
In this report.
I don't want to say everything. I want to go ahead and review the report before I give you a full answer, but my understanding is that it primarily tracks with the report.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Delegate Krim. Delegate Beitzel's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have one question, well, maybe a couple of questions. I'm just looking at the fiscal note, and there's one part of the fiscal note that said there's 71,000 initially in 2022 that comes from the special funds. That's a transportation trust fund. How is this bill impacting that fund to require that those funds be taken from the transportation trust fund?
Let me take a look, Delegate. I am not frankly familiar with that amount of money. This bill, from my understanding, had no fiscal note. So let me take a quick look.
Well, it says it has a $426,220 fiscal.
Let me take a look.
Special funds.
Special funds, okay. Yeah, I see the special funds.
I mean, the 426,000 general funds, and there's a $71,000 amount that comes from the transportation trust fund. I'm just wondering why they're taking it from there. What part of this bill would require taking transportation trust funds to establish this emergency procurement?
Delegate, so that we don't waste the committee's time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
I
Okay. I understand. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. The other question I have is, what's considered an emergency? And I agree with the two things that you pointed out, that there's some real questionable things going on there. But being it's a pandemic, there are, it's been, 8,000 deaths or more in Maryland from this, and in a whole bunch of cases. I think a pandemic would be construed to be something we would have to take emergency measures for. And so I'm not in disagreement with the fact that we need to make sure that these procurements are properly executed and monitored. So, but when you agree that a pandemic may cause unusual circumstances to arise?
I absolutely agree that a pandemic could, but I think that we also need to put that into perspective.
Mm-hmm.
We have been in a pandemic for a year. We have plenty of time to plan out the things that we might need in our ability to deal with this pandemic. But it is my understanding 1 year in that to this day, the Department of Health is still using the emergency procurement powers to procure various items, things that they anticipate that they need and have anticipated that they need, but yet refuse to go through the procurement process. I would say this: when we began the pandemic and we needed PPEs and we needed ventilators to get into hospitals, that constitutes an emergency. But at some point, you then have to say, okay, we're going to need so many PPEs into the future and plan for those and bid on those appropriately. That is no longer an emergency under a procurement definition. It's still, obviously, we're in a pandemic and we're still in an emergency. But what we ended up finding was we spent money, $12.5 million, to a company that did not have these products in hand. And by the time we got the products, it was literally weeks and even months. So the use of the emergency powers at that point, we have to ask ourselves, what's the point if we're not going to be able to get the product in 48 hours? If we can't get the product in 48 hours, or we have to secure some supply in a short period of time, absolutely use the emergency powers. But at this point, that's not what we're doing. We are simply using the guise of a year-long pandemic to go around procurement rules.
Hey, thank you. Thank you, Delegate. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Next question is from a member of the Health and Government Operations Committee, Delegate Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's nice to be with you guys this afternoon, and thank you, Delegate Resnick, for this bill. Since you go first and the unfavorables come after, I wanted to just review a couple points made by General Services, Department of General Services, to hear your response. Is that?
Sure. Okay,
so they, of course, come in as unfavorable. And their first argument seems to be that by requiring that the contract award be approved within 48 hours after being submitted to the CPO, the Chief Procurement Officer, it makes it difficult for them to respond to true emergencies because they have to wait 2 days. My understanding was the 48 hours is a ceiling, not a floor, so that the CPO could approve within minutes or hours. They don't have to wait 40. Am I misunderstanding that?
You are not. You are absolutely correct. There is nothing holding the CPO to a 48-hour limit. They can review it at any time within that 2-day period, depending on the emergency. But to move forward with public procurement, sometimes in the millions of dollars, without a single procurement officer laying eyes on it, without making sure that we are buying a product from a legitimate company, which to this day, I question whether Blue Flame Medical is a legitimate company, whether or not it is a company that is providing us with something that they know how to do, or is simply trying to pull one over on us the way that we have been pulled, the wool's been pulled over our eyes several times now in this process. We have to have somebody vet these companies from a procurement and logistics point of view. And that just isn't happening. We are grabbing things essentially off the shelves, being, facetious, but we are simply taking what's coming to us. And let me be clear. The Department of Health and our other state agencies during the pandemic have also done a lot of really good stuff. They have turned back numerous vendors who have tried to hoodwink us. They have gotten the necessary PPEs and equipment and everything else that we have needed to be able to deal with this pandemic in as best a way as possible. But having an emergency is never an excuse to bypass laws that are in place to make sure that we are taking care of the taxpayers' money. And if anything, this pandemic should be a signal to us that we need to prepare for things like this better. We should have already been prepared for this, but we weren't. And so now we need to make sure that if we're going to spend money on an emergency basis, there are professionals in place who are monitoring this and making sure that we are not going to waste taxpayer dollars.
Mr. Chairman, my follow-up?
Sure.
Okay, thank you. And I'm not going to go through the whole letter because they have some other things that I think are redundant, but they also take issue at the other end that somehow having to go through BPW as an afterthought. In other words, letting the CPO, who's the professional who actually understands procurement, weigh in, and then going after the fact to BPW is going to be problematic because, they meet every 2 weeks and it's hard to add these new emergency procurements to an agenda that's set up bi-weekly. And that's going to also be a problem. And again, I'm confused about that. And I didn't know if you had a response to why it is not problematic during a true emergency period, like we've seen in the pandemic, for BPW to put on the agenda, emergency procurement as a action item for every meeting.
Right. I mean, I don't understand why that's a problem either, especially after the fact. We're not keeping them from buying the product as long as the CPO approves. We're not keeping them from moving forward. We're just simply providing an after action report essentially to BPW to review these procurements to make sure we're doing the right thing. To suggest that it is somehow burdensome to go to the BPW, which is the highest procurement authority in our state. We don't purchase things unless BPW approves them over a certain threshold. So either BPW serves a function or it doesn't. You can't say that BPW is great for this, but not for that. BPW is the highest procurement authority of our state. It is their job to make sure we are spending taxpayer dollars wisely. And if we cannot allow them to review emergency procurements after the fact, then what is the point of having BPW anyway?
Okay, thank you very much. I just wanted to say that in my world, we differentiate between emergencies and things that are just urgent.
Sure.
And it might be helpful as the committees, the two committees consider this, that might be part of the thing. Everything's an emergency, but everything's not. Some things are just urgent and they're out of the typical, but that doesn't make them an emergency. Thank you
Which is
very
also
much.
why this bill provides for the expedited function rather than emergency, right? The 48 hours with the chief procurement officer, which, by the way, the Maryland Ports Commission and the Maryland Aviation Administration already have that function. So it's not like I'm trying to impose something new. on the state, some new procurement procedure on the state. We already do this, but just in a limited capacity.
Delegate Krebs is recognized.
Thank you. I was just reading about the current law. I'm sorry. Under current law, do they have to solicit any other bids?
For an emergency? No.
I mean, what? So you mentioned 2 high-profile ones this year, which I appreciate, and then you mentioned there were a number of other ones. On these other ones that are routine, do you deem that they're emergencies, or was this just a unique situation under this particular emergency?
I don't have a direct list of everything we've done over the last 8 years as to, the specifics of those emergencies. I only have the larger statistics about how they were deemed emergencies, but really didn't actually get purchased until 2 days, 7 days, or even 30 days later. We can probably get a list like that to you. We can probably work with BPW.
The reason I was wondering, I'm just wondering, considering this particular pandemic with all the emergencies, and I'm not just talking with a couple that you mentioned, which obviously were problematic and high profile, but we also had people not working, and in many parts of state government for very long periods of time. And I didn't know if this emergency was way different with all the other emergency procurements because of that, of the lack of people, being available maybe to do the procurements, or if it's something that's like this all the time outside of this particular pandemic emergency.
Yeah, I don't know that there's much of a difference, frankly. Yes, we did have folks who were working from home who may have had interrupted connections, et cetera, but the use of these emergency powers, again, have been around for a while. And I think it's time that we take a really hard look at them, not just over the last year, but how they've been used over the last 8 years or even multiple administrations. I mean, this is a very problematic issue. This is something that the federal government, for example, does not do. And I know there's emergency powers to do procurement at the federal level, but there are so many more guardrails and restrictions for our federal dollars than there are for our state dollars here. We need to be more careful with our taxpayer dollars and putting a few more restrictions in place to make sure that these procurements are reviewed properly is really not that big of a burden.
No, thank you. And I thank you for having the committee that Joint Evaluation Committee report and this being based on that. I have not read it, but it sounds like a good read. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Delegate Krebs, and thank you very much, Delegate Resnick. If the committee could please keep in mind, we have 4 more bills to get through that members of the Appropriations Committee needs to get to another meeting. So for the next 4 bills, if we could keep our questions very succinct if possible. Are there any other questions at this time for House Bill 1091? Okay, great. Next, we have testimony. We have Mr. Vince McAvoy, oral testimony in favor of it. Mr. McAvoy, if you're here, if you could please limit your testimony to 2 minutes.
Correct. Thank you, Delegate. Can you hear me all right?
We sure can. Please proceed when you're ready.
All right. Thank you so much. And I want to thank Delegate Resnick for bringing this bill. This is awesomely timed. I think that we have a lot of value to this. I saw very concerning things at the onset of this emergency last year. And just to echo on Delegate Hill's note, perpetual emergency doesn't exist. That's life, okay? We do have urgent things, and we have a little bit familiar with BPW and monitored some of their issues, and I thank the delegate for bringing this. I think there's courage to that. What is particularly troubling to me as I look at the event that happened last year, this is the one that's in my mind. I know you spoke about others, and I may not know of those. But the one that spoke in my mind was deliberately timed after the onset of the emergency. It involved a foreign state. It involved relatives, and it wasn't checked. And recent documentation has just been released in the past 2 weeks, which show that the open-endedness of this emergency was pre-known last March. I saw something on Twitter today that we're on the 366th day of March. We've gone beyond ludicrous, and I do hope that a formal and thorough investigation is made on the issues that have led down this path. And I think that we absolutely, guarding ourselves going forward, the money is one thing. The issue of it being tied to political ends and political motivations is extremely troubling. I thank you for the committee and the committee for the work that you're doing on this. I urge you to dig deeper. I urge a favorable.
Thank you very much, Mr. McAvoy. Are there any questions from members of the House Appropriations Committee for Mr. McAvoy? Seeing none, within our packets, we also have written testimony from the Maryland Department of General Services, Maryland Department of Transportation, also MTBMA. That concludes the bill hearing for House Bill 1091. Next, we'll move to House Bill 1092, Delegate Rosenberg, State Procurement Emergency and Expedite Procurements, Revision and Reporting. Delegate Rosenberg, please proceed when you're ready.
Thank you, Chairman Chang. It's always good to be back in the Appropriations Committee, and I'll be back next week as well. Delegate Resnick began his testimony by saying that perhaps we're on the same wavelength because on this issue, as well as on an issue next week, we've introduced very similar bills. That perhaps could be because we're both past chairs of the Health Subcommittee, or I'm a past chair, excuse me. Delegate Resnick is the current chair, excuse me. Also because the grandfather whose name I bear, Samuel I. Rosenberg, left Russia about 80, 90 years before Kirill and his parents did. So that's how we both got to America. This bill is very similar to 1091 because it is based on the same report by the group Office of Program Evaluation and Government Accountability within the Office of the Legislative Auditor. I have added an amendment, which I hopefully is before the committee. One of the recommendations of the OPEGA was to address the significant drop-off in minority business participation on emergency procurements. That is not in either of our bills as introduced. It was part of the recommendations. And my amendment would provide that the Special Secretary of the Office of Small Minority and Women Business Affairs, in consultation with the Secretary of Transportation and the Attorney General, should establish guidelines to consider when determining the use of the appropriate minority business enterprise participation for these emergency procurements. It's a different set of circumstances, but the evidence was that there was a significant drop off. I would also add that along with Delegate Krim, she's the current chair of the office, or the House chair of the Joint Committee on Legislative Audits. I've chaired that subcommittee as well, that joint committee. And I think everybody on this committee knows that when the Office of Legislative Audits does a report, it has it reviewed, gives the opportunity to the agency to review it before it becomes public. I don't know if that's the same circumstance here for this report, because it's done by an office within legislative audits, but certainly as a suggestion, as this committee grapples with the importance of this issue, to have those sides, those parties, both Office of Legislative Audits and the affected agencies, to be part of around the table as you seek to come with the right legislative solution, suggesting as an option for how this should be done, because these folks are trained to work with the relevant agencies to come out with ultimately the right public policy solution. We, as Delegate Resnick pointed out, we need to define an emergency. These situations are going to return, and the evidence, as he pointed out, over the last 366 days, particularly at the outset, indicates the need for improvements in that process, which is what our two bills would do, along with my amendment. So move for a favorable on either bill. Doesn't matter to me which one, obviously. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Delegate Rosenberg, for presenting the bill and the amendment. Are there any questions from the members of the House Appropriations Committee at this time that need to be presented to the bill sponsor? Seeing none, there are no additional oral witnesses today on this bill, but we do have written testimony from the Maryland Department of General Services, Maryland Department of Transportation, MTBMA, MAA on this bill. Thank you so much to Delegates Hill, Delegate Rosenberg, and Delegate Krebs for being here representing Maryland from the Health and Government Operations Committee. We appreciate you all being here. Next, that concludes the bill hearing for House Bill 1092. Next, we'll hear House Bill 1253, Delegate Washington, National Capital Strategic Economic Development Program eligibility. Delegate Washington, we know that you have a time engagement to be at, so please proceed when you're ready.
I am ready, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. And to the members of the committee, thank you for allowing me to be here. For the record, Delegate Alonzo Washington to present on House Bill 1253. This is a simple fix to a issue that the Maryland Department of Housing and Community Development brought to my attention. There were some amendments that were passed in previous years as we developed this fund, and as we're trying to perfect this fund, which is brand new to the state. There were several different issues that this bill seeks to rectify. The bill revises the language to make sure that the funding is only used in sustainable communities that are completely or partially inside the Beltway in Prince George's and Montgomery County, where the funded is needed the most. So that's the clarifying language that we needed, Mr. Chairman, and I ask this committee for a favorable report.
Thank you very much, Vice Chairman Washington, for presenting House Bill 1253. Are there any questions at this time from members of the Appropriations Committee for this bill? Seeing none, we do have favorable oral testimony from Chris Gillis with MHP. If Mr. Gillis is here, if you could please proceed when you're ready in a 2-minute time limit, please.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon, members of the committee. My name is Chris Gillis, and I'm testifying on behalf of MHP to urge a favorable with amendments report on House Bill 1253. By way of background, MHP is a nonprofit affordable housing provider with apartment communities located throughout Montgomery and Prince George's counties. As the committee knows, the National Capital Strategic Economic Development Fund, or NED, supports residential and commercial neighborhood revitalization activities in Montgomery and Prince George's counties. NED is critical to ensuring that we maintain a diverse mix of affordable housing options in high-cost jurisdictions and to positioning small businesses to survive and thrive in today's economy. HB 1253 would modify the areas of Montgomery and Prince George's County that are eligible for NED and limit funding in future years to projects located at least partially within the Beltway. Currently, projects must be located in state-designated sustainable communities inside the Beltway in order to be eligible. Projects in sustainable communities outside the Beltway are also eligible, provided that they are in an opportunity zone or an enterprise zone. We support the effort to simplify the eligibility requirements for NED and to do away with the enterprise zone and opportunity zone eligibility criteria. However, due to a technical difference in the way the two counties designate their sustainable communities, the bill as drafted would have the effect of reducing the number of neighborhoods that are eligible for NED in Montgomery County, places like Wheaton, White Oak, and Montgomery Village, for example. Whereas in Prince George's County, the bill would expand eligibility to areas not previously eligible. Generally speaking, we support expanding eligibility to areas outside the Beltway because most all of these communities are in urban environments where the costs of construction are higher, and the NED program helps mitigate against these risks. We're in communication with the bill sponsors and DHCD staff regarding this technical issue and request that the committee work with the sponsors to identify a solution that does not disadvantage projects in one county over another. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gillis. Are there any questions from members of the committee for Mr. Gillis at this time? Seeing none, thank you very much. That ends the bill hearing for House Bill 1253. Next, we will move on to House Bill 1055, which is presented by the chairman of the Capital Budget, Chairman Barnes, the Capital Budget, Legislative Initiatives, Alterations. Chairman Barnes, please proceed when ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. House Bill 1055 just endeavors to streamline our LBI process by changing the model language, clarifying that no match be required for our LBIs. This is in line with what the governor's done during his tenure, which I think has worked well for miscellaneous grants. So this would put us in line with that. I think it also for projects under $500,000 says that they don't need to run in front of the VPS for approval, which I think is a good thing. And I think even those at the Board of Public Works would tell you that for our mom and pop organizations, we're talking about our VFWs, our local firehouses, our local municipal buildings, places to get small small dollar LBIs, legislative bond initiatives, that it's just not necessary. This is just a clerical function that we're relieving them of to streamline this process. With that, that's the bill.
Thank you very much, Chairman Barnes. Are there any questions from members of the Appropriations Committee for Chairman Barnes regarding House Bill 1055? There is additional written testimony in our packets from the Maryland Department of General Services and also the Comptroller of Maryland for House Bill 55. That concludes the bill hearing for House Bill 1055. Next we'll move to House Bill 1053, which is presented by the Chairman of the Education Economic Development Subcommittee, Delegate Barnes, operating budget education programs mandating funding. Chairman Barnes, please proceed when you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're all familiar in this committee with the state aided institutions education budget that we hear every year. The subcommittee is very familiar because we actually hear from those institutions. These are institutions like the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, the Aquarium, the Maryland Science Center, who receive money under the education budget to do educational programs for students, to make sure that all students, no matter their socioeconomic background, can participate in these programs. It is a program that has worked extremely well over the years, to the extent that my entire tenure here, the governors have put in between $5 and $6 million into the program. These organizations have become reliant in providing these educational opportunities on this funding. Know that we have seen over the last 2 years, one of the Chesapeake Bay Foundation's money cut by the governor on the program. In subcommittee, we have asked the agency to explain to us why this cut has occurred, and frankly, we have not gotten any good answer, which leads the committee to believe that this is really just arbitrary and potentially even capricious action that really has no justification. So what we've done here is we've said, look, we are going to value and understand the value of these state aided institutions, and we're going to fund them every year. We've left some wiggle room for the governor to fund additional organizations above what has been funded the last 2 years. And we're going to make sure that these organizations can continue to provide the great service to our state that they have. So rather than me tell you about the great work that they do, I know that they are here to testify about their great work and things that they do in providing opportunities for our kids. So I'll let them do that portion of it. The bill does require an amendment. I think when the amendment office or the bill drafter editing office got a hold of it, they made some tweaks that we need to correct. But my testimony is in line with what the intent of the bill is and where it will be once we put the amendment.
Thank you very much, Chairman Barnes. Are there any questions from members of the House Appropriations Committee for Chairman Barnes on House Bill 1053? Seeing none, we have favorable testimony from 3 individuals today. We'll hear those favorable testimonies. And after we hear from all 3, then we'll take questions from members of the committee. First, we have Lori Spielman with Holyfield Station Elementary School. Ms. Spielman, thank you for being here. We'd like to keep it at a 2-minute time limit if you could, and please proceed when you're ready.
All right. Good afternoon, Chair and members of the committee. My name is Lori Spillman, and I'm a gifted and talented resource teacher at Holyfield Station Elementary School in Howard County. My students have been participating in Chesapeake Bay Foundation programs for over 10 years, and I'm here today in support of the CBF state-aided institution funding. If I were physically in the room with you right now, I would give you an oyster. I would ask you to inspect it, observe it. What do you notice? What do you wonder? Many of you may ask, how old is this oyster? What role does the oyster play in the bay? How does it filter the bay's water? What does it eat? This curiosity about the oyster is what we need to foster in our students. Take a moment to look around you. Almost everything you see was created by someone's curiosity. We learn, grow, and improve from curiosity. This is where Chesapeake Bay Foundation comes into play. CBF's educational programs take students outside to explore the Chesapeake Bay watershed, where their curated activities encourage curiosity and a love of the bay. Over the years, our students have participated in water quality testing, oyster dredging, and seining for bay organisms to look for biodiversity. Additionally, they've studied green architecture and canoed on Black Walnut Creek to study tidal marshes. The students build their knowledge and actively construct meaning for themselves as they discover the importance of the bay's health and how humans can positively and negatively affect their surroundings. What I love about Chesapeake Bay Foundation educators is that they don't seek to provide any particular right answer in studying environmental issues with students. They seek to instruct learners through self-discovery as they evaluate different viewpoints. Not only do the students learn about the Bay, they become stewards of the Bay, wanting to preserve and protect it. CBF programs have inspired our students to take action on their school grounds. Holly Food Station students have planted 150 trees on the school property to increase animal habitat and to reduce runoff. They made over 20 oyster reef balls to increase oyster population in the Bay. I could go on and on. Our students truly want to make a difference. CBF programs create the spark that fuel the students' curiosity.
Thank you so much, Ms. Spielman. Thank you.
Can I just finish up one thing?
Please go ahead.
Thank you. The Chesapeake Bay Foundation is our oyster. They play a large role in educating our youth and teachers. And environmental literacy is so critically important for our future generations. Please remember to restore the CBF state-aided institution funding and the Maryland State Department of Education budget. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Spielman.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
Just, I have to, just wanted to let the committee know, since this is my bill that we're on, that I have to jump off to join the same meeting that Delegate Washington is on, but I want to thank all the witnesses for being here and apologize.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We know you have other matters to take care of, so thank you for being here. Okay, next, we will hear from Ms. Karen Mullen with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. Ms. Mullen, if you keep your testimony at 2 minutes, please. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, Chair and members of the committee. I'm here to speak on behalf of House Bill 1053 that, with the sponsor's amendment, would restore CBF SAI funding to FY20 levels. I'm the Director of Professional Learning at CBF, meaning that I work with teachers and supervisors across the state to make sure that they can reach their environmental literacy goals. We all know that education is a little crazy right now. It's really tough times, and I know you're hearing that from everyone. Yet despite all of these challenges, CBF remains a valuable partner in delivering meaningful experiences to students about their local environment. We are doing it online now, but like everyone else, we can't wait to get back out there and do it in person. And to do that, CBF needs the restoration of this funding that we had been receiving for almost 40 years to deliver these programs to the most underserved students in our state. Imagine the student in Baltimore who's standing on the deck of a boat in their harbor, watching in amazement as an oyster is opened in front of them, as Lori was just talking about oysters, or paddling in a canoe through the brackish marshes of Meredith Creek and hearing birds call and making that connection between water quality and their actions. These experiences are critical to being an educated Maryland citizen, and that's why we are all committed to environmental literacy, and that's why we at CBF are committed to leveraging this funding so that we can continue to serve every district in the state and continue to serve over 10,000 students annually in Maryland. Especially in these trying times, it's been so exciting for us to hear and read testimony from the students and teachers like Lori and Emma, the student you're going to hear from soon, that say that CBF is a valued and important partner in the delivery of essential learning to our students. So thank you, and if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. And we urge the committee's favorable report to restore CBF funding to fiscal year 20 levels.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mullen. Very much appreciate your testimony. Next, we have a very special guest here who's going to be providing testimony, Ms. Emma Bison with Towson High School.
Hi, thank you. Good afternoon, members of the committee. My name is Emma Bison, and I am a junior at Towson High School. I would like to share my experiences in the Chesapeake Bay Foundation's environmental education programs and urge you to endorse the restoration of CBF's state-aided institution funding through House Bill 1053. I was accepted to participate in CBF's July Student Leadership Masterclass in the spring of 2020. That summer, several other camps and internships that I had applied to were canceled due to the pandemic. To my surprise, the CBF education program did not cancel, but rather it adapted to a virtual setting. Before I had even participated in the program, I was amazed by the dedication of CBF to providing educational programs to students, even when faced with seemingly insurmountable challenges. This determination to educate, support, and empower students across the watershed is what makes the CBF education programs such an important opportunity for students. CBF education programs both inspire a passion for the environment and provide the tools necessary to advocate for change. Beginning with that summer expedition and through the rest of 2020, I have learned how to be an environmental activist. The CBF education programs have improved my public speaking skills and expanded my knowledge of the environment through experiential learning. Furthermore, these programs have allowed me to develop an openness to diverse perspectives. These programs provide support while encouraging initiative. From working to form a watershed outdoor Bill of Rights to educating my community about monarch butterflies, CBF educators have inspired me to advocate for changes in ways I could not have imagined. My hope is that other students can experience the same spark of environmental stewardship. Please support the restoration of CBF's state-aided institution funding so that they can continue to offer these valuable experiences to students across Maryland. CBF education programs inspire students to enact the change they hope to see in the world. We urge the committee's favorable report of House Bill 1053. Thank you for your time and consideration.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bisson. Great job. Are there any questions from members of the House Appropriations Committee for the witnesses? Seeing none, thank you very much, everyone, for being here, and have a great day. That ends the bill hearing for House Bill 1053. Next, we will move on to House Bill 905, Delegate Bridges, Education, Workforce Development, and Sequence Scholarships Eligibility. Delegate Bridges, thank you very much for allowing us to go out of order on the agenda. We appreciate it, and please proceed when you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. I got a little scared there for a second. Thought you forgot all about me and my bill. So thank you, Mr. Vice Chair and members of the committee. This bill really expands the eligibility for the Workforce Development Sequence Scholarship to include Maryland residents or graduates of a high school who enroll in a registered apprenticeship program, such as electricians, sheet metal workers, HVAC, and so on. Currently, there's a lack of funding support for students who are looking to get into a registered apprenticeship program that prepares them for skilled trades. So the Workforce Development Sequence Scholarship is currently available to Maryland students to help pay tuition for non-credited certificate and licensure programs, as well as registered apprenticeship programs. But under our current law, they must be enrolled in the community college. That means that registered apprenticeship programs that currently partner directly with colleges and still provide that in-classroom instruction on campus are not currently considered eligible because students are not technically enrolled in their colleges. So with this bill and the proposed amendments, it will ensure that the students who want to enroll in an apprenticeship program but don't have the means to afford it would actually be eligible to receive the scholarship to help pay for the first year of the program before they begin their on-the-job training in year 2, in which the employer actually pays the rest of the way through the program. Again, the amendment, which I have, makes the legislation more targeted, ensure that the scholarships only apply to registered apprenticeship programs who partner directly with the community colleges and to self-funded first-year students who don't receive federal or financial aid and are not employed in the industry yet. So this legislation really will help pay self-paid individuals who truly need the support to pay for their first year in the program prior to employment and set them on a path for in-demand jobs and sustainable wages. You'll soon hear from two people who can tell you a little bit more about the program and its benefits. And I realized that there was originally in your packet a letter of opposition from the Maryland Association of Community Colleges Continuing Education Affinity Group. We've been in conversation. Hopefully you'll hear from that person today with a favorable amendment to the sequencing scholarship. I think with the amendment that they're going to offer, it re-articulates the fact that the focus should be on first year self-funded students, ease any concerns that they have. And so with that, I would hope that we can move for a favorable report, and I'd be more than happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Delegate Bridges. Are there any questions from members of the House Appropriations Committee for Delegate Bridges for House Bill 905 at this time? We have two people who are going to be providing favorable testimony. It's also written testimony in our packets, and we can hear from both of them, and then we'll hear from the unfavorable testimony. First, we have Charles Hayden with Heating and Air Conditioning Contractor. Mr. Hayden, if you could please proceed when you're ready, and 2-minute time limit, sir. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Vice Chair Chang and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today in support of House Bill 905 to expand the eligibility for Workforce Development Sequence Scholarship. My name is Charles Hayden, and I am the president and owner of Hayden Mechanical Services. I'm based in Finksburg, Maryland. I'm also a member of the Heating Air Conditioning Contractors of Maryland, which is also known as HACC. I'm a past president, a current board member, a current education chair, and an instructor in the HACC's apprenticeship program for the HVACR technicians. On behalf of HVACC and our members, over 150 members, I would like to respectfully urge the committee to vote in favor of this bill. I have been an instructor for HACC apprenticeship program for 6 years, and I've seen firsthand how it opens the doors to help Marylanders get the skills, training they need to be successful in our industry, providing critical HVAC services across our state. Our apprenticeship program partners with 4 community colleges to deliver our program, which combines in-classroom instruction, on-the-job training, and 4 years so that the students earn their journeyman license upon completion. The bill will make a small, important change to the publicly funded Workforce Development Sequence Scholarship to broaden eligibility to include students who are enrolling in an apprenticeship program. That is registered by the Maryland Department of Labor Apprenticeship Training Council and also partnered with the community colleges at the same time. We have seen students who are interested in our program but ultimately cannot enroll simply because they can't come up with the funding. And unfortunately, that disproportionately affects low-income individuals and those from disadvantaged communities. This year alone, we had 8 students apply. 7 of them were students of color, and 1 was a veteran who applied but ultimately weren't able to pay for the first year of the program. The $2,000 award provided, but the scholarship could make all the difference in the world to those students
Mr. Hayden,
who could not otherwise have the resources.
If you could please summarize, Mr. Hayden. Thank you. Thank you very much. If you could please summarize.
Thank you.
If you want to finish up, just real
No, I'm really at the end. I'm good.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you, Mr. Hayden. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we'll hear from Peter Constantinu with the Association of Air Conditioning Professionals. If you could please limit your testimony to 2 minutes, please. Thank you.
Vice Chair Chang, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today in support of HB 905. My name is Peter Constantino, and I am the Executive Director of the Association of Air Conditioning Professionals, AACP. AACP is a trade association with a membership of over 110 professional HVAC contractor companies. We administer a registered apprenticeship program for HVAC technicians. AACP is respectfully urging your support for this bill to help Maryland students and transitioning workers who want to enroll in a registered apprenticeship program but don't have the resources to do so. The AACP apprenticeship program partners with Montgomery Community College, and our apprentices receive credits towards an associate degree from Montgomery College when they graduate, in addition to the opportunity to receive a Maryland journeyperson's license without having to sit for the exam. However, in spite of our partnership, students enrolling in our apprenticeship program are not currently eligible for the Maryland Higher Education Commission's Workforce Development Sequence Scholarship. The scholarship is designed to provide financial assistance of up to $2,000 for students enrolling in a non-credited certificate program leading to apprenticeships, employment, licensure, or job skill enhancement. The AACP apprenticeship program checks all of these boxes. The program puts students on a career path to high-demand, skilled jobs in the HVAC industry. For reference, AACP member technicians receive an average journey workers rate of $26.62 per hour, or over $50,000 per year. Our apprentices attend class 2 nights a week for 7 months out of the year, and that related instruction is complemented by on-the-job training. Once our apprentices get a job required beginning in their 2nd year, the employers cover the cost of tuition. That's why it makes sense to expand eligibility to first-year self-funded students, ensuring that existing funds are targeted to those who miss out on apprenticeship opportunities because they don't have a job yet and simply because they can't get their foot in the door. For all of these reasons, AACP strongly supports this bill and the sponsor amendment, and we respectfully ask for a favorable report from the committee. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Are there any questions from members of the committee for Mr. Hayden or Mr. Constantino? Seeing none, thank you very much, gentlemen, for being here. Next,
Thank you.
You're welcome, Kelly Cormer with the Maryland Association of Community Colleges, Continuing Education and Training Affinity Group. Ms. Cormer, thank you very much for being here. And if you could please limit your testimony to 2 minutes, we'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair and committee members. Good afternoon. As indicated, my name is Kelly Kermer, and I'm testifying on behalf of the Maryland Association of Community Colleges, Continuing Education and Training Affinity Group, also known as MCASIT. Previously, I had submitted testimony as unfavorable, but with amendments, I am now testifying as favorable to this bill. Maryland's community colleges are committed to making workforce development training accessible to all Marylanders. Without the workforce development sequence scholarship, some Marylanders may not have access to workforce training across multiple industries. Just $1 million per year in workforce development sequence scholarships is allocated via enrollment formulas across Maryland's 16 community colleges. What this means is that for some mid-size and smaller colleges, this funding is only sufficient to support scholarships for 30 or less students. Especially as community colleges are playing such an important role in preparing workers displaced by COVID to get back to work, it is important that this limited funding is stewarded properly. MCASIT's position is favorable toward House Bill 905, conditioned upon a proposed amendment indicating that eligibility is limited to a first-year self-paying student enrolling directly in a registered apprenticeship program that is partnered with a public community college in the state. As apprenticeship training offered through community colleges is already eligible for workforce development sequence funding under the Education Article, Section 183301, C1, I1, it is recommended that the language of the amendment be added to further clarify that section, which appears on HB 905, page 2, line 10. Without this amendment, MCASIT cannot support the bill as it will dilute scholarships available to students in non-apprenticeship workforce programs. Although additional funding for workforce development sequence scholarship is not contemplated in this fiscal year, MCASIT strongly encourages this committee and the General Assembly in the future to expand funding for this program that advances Maryland's workforce and positions businesses to thrive, again, especially in light of all the retraining that's necessary for COVID. Thank you for your consideration, and I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Cormer, for your testimony and your spirit of collaboration. Are there any questions from members of the committee to Ms. Cormer? Seeing none, that ends the bill hearing for House Bill 905. Everyone have a great day. Next, we will move on to House Bill 918, and presenting for the first time in the House Appropriations Committee, we have Delegate Ampry, Higher Education, Maryland Loan Assistance Repayment Program, Underrepresented Teachers. Again, he is presenting for the first time before the House Appropriations Committee. Delegate Ampry, we thank you for being here, and please proceed when you're ready.
Thank you so much for having me. I assume that calling out is my first time. I'm going to expect some heavy questions later, maybe. But for the record, my name is Delegate Marlon Ampry here in support for House Bill 918, where we are seeking to provide a loan assistance repayment program for underrepresented teachers here in the state of Maryland. This legislation seeks to address this imbalance of teachers of color and teachers that are underrepresented by providing an incentive system for the recruitment and retention of teachers that are historically underrepresented in our classrooms, especially Black and Latino men. I can speak to my own experience as a former teacher. One of the reasons that I wanted to go into the classroom and teach for as long as I did was because I knew there was a lack of Black men entering the classroom. And unfortunately, that is still the case today. And one of the reasons that I stepped into this legislature was to have the opportunity to introduce legislation like this so we can get more men that look like me and more men that are underrepresented and other groups that are underrepresented in the classroom to come to the classroom and stay in the classroom. Only about 25% of Maryland's teachers are from minority groups, and that number presumably is even lower when we control for the amount of male versus female teachers. And that is a concerning number considering that in my city, the great city of Baltimore, over 90% of our students are students of color. Years of data show a strong causal link between increased early academic achievement when adolescent students are exposed to at least one teacher who reflects their own demographic in elementary school, as early as elementary school. And even my time in the classroom, my last 2 years in the classroom, I had the opportunity to teach exclusively young men, Black and Latino boys, mostly from Baltimore City and Prince George's County. And we were able to create historic numbers in math assessment. And I was really happy to see those numbers go up. But I think one of the reasons, outside of my students' amazing grit, was the ability for me to be able to connect with my students. And for many of my students, they would come up to me and say, "Hey, Mr. Ampry, you're the first Black man I've ever had as a teacher." And I want that to not be the norm, that they have to wait until 6th grade for that to happen, or even high school for many students. And what this bill will do, it will provide assistance with educational expenses, such as student loans for educational professionals who live and work in Maryland schools. In exchange, these teachers will be obligated to work in a Maryland school for a predetermined amount of time based on the amount of assistance received. Priority will be given to the most underrepresented groups reflected in the student population, which currently consists of Black and Latino male applicants. So right now we know we have a really high need for male, Black, and Latino teachers, but as those numbers change, whatever our needs are, this money will be available for those teachers to apply for the money and get those assistance in paying back those loans. Because my conversations with principals, my conversations with superintendents has been that while we can get teachers in the door, the retention is one of the biggest issues. And that's what this legislation will do. One of the reasons that a lot of teachers say they're leaving is because of the cost of being able to pay back their loans and working towards having a way in which they can have a better lifestyle. Legislation with similar intent has been in effect in South Carolina since 2006 and has found success there. South Carolina Teacher Incentive Fund, part of a larger teacher advancement program. But what they also discovered is that one of their biggest factors in their recruitment process that their HBCUs were doing and so forth was the retention piece. And this legislation will hopefully do that. Moving forward, this bill will be important to also provide firm support for schools where these teachers may be placed, districts with students living in poverty, high crime areas, etc. Applicants will not only be required to teach, but they will also be required to give back in some other form. I think that it's important that while we have these teachers there, another component of this is that they will have to, whether it's volunteer, whether it's coach, do something in the community and mentor outside of just their obligations in the classroom. And this bill is really needed in a time when education has been a focal point of what we are doing here in this legislature, the understanding of the inequities that we have in regards to race. And we know that the number one way to improve educational achievement and for our students is having amazing teachers that are committed to the crafts and that are doing excellent work. And I think this bill is going to ensure that we have teachers that reflect the student population in the classroom doing amazing work at a high level. And today you will hear testimony in support of this bill from professors from UMBC who have studied this exact phenomenon more closely on the connection between having teachers from underrepresented groups be in the classroom with those students and how it can really improve their achievement and their ability to do well. And with that said, I'll leave it to my panel to go ahead and discuss those things. But I hope that the committee will find it in their heart to give us a favorable report on House Bill 918. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Delegate Ampry. Are there any questions from members of the House Appropriations Committee for Delegate Ampry? Okay, looks like we have several questions for you. So as part of our ritual as a member for the first time presenting for Appropriations Committee, we like to just mess with them a little bit, but you did a great job. But let's give our newest delegate a hand too for doing a great job.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Well, wonderful. So are there any questions from members of the Appropriations Committee for Delegate Ampry? Delegate Mangione.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Delegate, for your bill. I guess I'm listening. I absolutely agree in nature with the idea of trying to help the teachers and to motivate and encourage more people to get into teaching. I guess my concern, though, is what would classify, or is there a list in terms of minority? Because I guess my concern is some people being left out. And I know some people that are teachers that are white that live very modest means, have student loans, and can really struggle to pay back their own loans. And a cousin, for example, very modest, has a daughter. She goes to public schools. I think she teaches at a private school now, but her student loans are through the roof. Now, she would not qualify for this? Is there programs that she does qualify for? And why wouldn't this program, I think, be open for for all teachers? Or
Thank you so much for your question. So again, I understand and thank you to your you said it was your cousin that's as a teacher. You know, I think teachers are some of the most important people in this world. So thank you for her contribution, or his contribution. But I think that the goal of this bill is to touch on the people who are in most need. And we know that the student populations in areas throughout this state that are where we would call high incidence of poverty, where we have students who are seeing high incidence of violence, students who are dealing with trauma. These students we know would benefit the most from seeing an underrepresented, a person that looks like them in the classroom. So the goal of this legislation is to ensure that we can get more of those people into the classroom. Like right now, only 2% of teachers of teachers in America are Black men. Only 2%, right? Those numbers are ridiculous, and it's really sad. And I think Maryland should be one of the states where we get this right. So that's the goal of this legislation. The goal of this legislation is not to say that someone else doesn't deserve anything or that someone else is more deserving. The goal of this legislation is to say that our kids are in need, and the data shows that the best way we can ensure that these kids can get what they need is they have more people that look like them in front of them. So the important part of this bill, what this bill is going to do is going to allow for us to get more of those teachers into the classroom. And then assessing the needs of the teachers, it's not going to be that, the teacher who man, I'm gonna stay in the classroom so I can add, $15,000 more a year so I can go ahead and, upgrade and get this, better car, this, way bigger house. It's gonna, if you look at the bill actually details the ways in which it's gonna actually assess the need, what's really needed here, how much help have they already received through other types of programs and loans. So it's not just gonna be a blanketed system where we're gonna get, everybody's just gonna walk in the door and get an extra $15,000 just because you're a Black man, right? It's gonna look at all the other factors to ensure that what can we do with those men or those other underrepresented groups that are like, hey, I really want to stay in the classroom, but I really just can't afford to stay in the classroom. I got to knock down some of these loans that I have, or I have, responsibilities to my family that I got to do. I need more support. So that's kind of the goal of the bill, is to say, hey, we know what students need the most help. This population needs to stay in the classroom the longest. It's a specific need that we're trying to deal with, a specific issue for our specific kids. It's not to say that any other group is undeserving or doesn't warrant support. So that I hope that answers your question in some way.
No, that's a great answer, and I appreciate it. I guess, and I totally understand what you're saying. I guess my only concern would be if a program like this does not exist for somebody who's not a minority, then I don't think.
I mean,
but I understand what you're saying.
I think the issue is that students who are not minorities get to see people who look like them in the classroom every day, right? So that's the issue, is that people who are white, if they go to a school, they see people that look like them all the time. If you go to Baltimore City schools, our school system does not reflect our student population. And the data shows, when you look at student success rates, when the students have teachers that look like them, and the students have teachers that come from the same backgrounds as them, the students do better. So it's not to say that one group doesn't deserve something. It's just more to say.
No, I'm not arguing that point. Yeah. I understand what you're saying. I'm saying, I thought the teacher, I'm saying, like the individual, right, my cousin would not be able to benefit from something that other people would be. And that's where I have the disconnect. But I 100% understand what you're saying.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. And I think that maybe there's ways we can, think about the bill in a way in which another bill can be forwarded along that can deal with the issues that other groups might face, but as far as money, and we got to figure out, there's always ways we can figure out to get more money in teachers' hands. I'm all for it. We can talk about it. We can make those kind of bills happen. But for this bill, this is for a specific need, specific issue for a specific population that we need to get fixed immediately.
Well, thank you, Delegate. I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you.
The gentleman from the city of Baltimore is recognized, Delegate Bridges.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. And thank you, Delegate, for bringing this bill to us. I think this is a very important bill, because I can remember even growing up in Baltimore City public schools, I know by name the 3 Black male teachers that I had and the 1 Black substitute male teacher that I had. I can remember every last one of their names. So I think it is important to have people that maybe look like us to also teach us throughout our time in elementary, middle, and high school. But I do have a question about one of it looks like Maryland State Education Association put in a favorable with amendments. And I was wondering what you thought about those amendments, because it looks like they want to include certified student support personnel like school psychologists, counselors, and social workers. And the other thing the other part that they wanted to include were educators who participated in traditional education preparation programs from a 2 or 4 year Institute of Higher Ed. So just wondered what you thought about those as friendly amendments.
The Second Amendment, I think that's something I would definitely be willing to add. I don't, it doesn't really matter how you got to be in the classroom. I think it's ultimately what can we do to keep you there, because we know if you stay longer, you become a better teacher. If you stay longer, you're also able to encourage, hopefully mentor other teachers that come along. And then also we know that if you stay longer, you're going to impact more kids, right? So I think that's always a way we can do that. On the First Amendment, I still need to think that through. I think that, the focus here is teachers. I know that, my data is, this bill is based on the data of the teacher, right? So I don't know what the data says about school psychologists, even though I currently have a bill right now working on a work group to get more people of color into the mental health fields and other counseling fields. So I understand that need, but I'm not sure. I'd have to sit with them and parse through the data and understand like what is the correlation between the student has a school psychologist, does that improve the educational outcome? Overall, overwhelming data is, but that's something that I'm not currently opposed to, but I got to think through that a little bit more.
Yep. Or it could be another bill, like you said. So
exactly.
Yep. All right, I appreciate it.
Well, thank you for your question.
Are there any other questions from members of the House Appropriations Committee for Delegate Ampry on this bill? This afternoon, joining us from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, UMBC, we have 3 witnesses who are going to be providing favorable testimony. And to each of them, please limit your testimony to 2 minutes. First, we have Dr. Raymond Goings. Dr. Goings, thank you very much for being here, and please proceed when you're ready.
Thank you, Vice Chair Chang and members of the committee. My name is Dr. Ramon Goings, and I'm an assistant professor in the Language, Literacy, and Culture doctoral program at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and expert on Black male teacher success, as well as diversifying the teacher and school leader workforce. The data is clear that Black and Latino men represent 2% of the teaching workforce, and nationally, 17% of all teachers are teachers of color. However, when we look at the student loan debt issue, 4 years after graduation, 48% of Black undergraduates owe an average of more than 12% than they borrowed. So when you combine this data, when we look at underrepresented teachers, it is very likely they may not consider teaching because of the high student loan debt and then the perceived mismatch in salary as being an educator. However, when we look at the data around Black and Latino male success with students, the data is clear that they have an impact on student achievement, and more importantly, they have an impact on the lives of children. As a former music education and special education teacher myself, I had an impact on the students that I taught. One particular student, when I taught in Montebello Elementary and Junior Academy in Baltimore City Public Schools, told me that I was a student that he could have an image of. He saw me wearing a sweater, he wanted to be like me. He saw me doing something positive with my life, and he wanted to do the same. However, what my students didn't know is that if I did not have student loan assistance from an outside entity to support me, I might not have been a teacher because of the student loan debt that I had myself. And so with that, along with that, underrepresented teachers like myself are touted for the improvement that we have with students of color, but we also benefit all students. So what I urge you today is to consider, if you care about all of Maryland's children, having a teacher of color who can positively impact the lives of children, please be in support of this bill to provide student loan assistance so that schools can recruit and retain one of their greatest assets, teachers. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Goings. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Keisha Allen. Dr. Allen.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Keisha Allen, an assistant professor of education at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and I'm here to submit testimony in support of HB 918, the Higher Education Maryland Loan Assistance Repayment Program focused on underrepresented teachers. I'm in support of this legislation mainly because we know that there are unique challenges that Black and Brown teacher candidates face as they pursue teaching credentials, and that these challenges may serve as barriers to having a diverse teaching force. We also know that Black and Brown teachers overwhelmingly choose to teach in schools attended by Black and Brown children that are often characterized as hard to staff and that have high turnover when positions are filled with alternative certification candidates. Legislation such as this would help to not only increase the numbers of Black and Brown teachers within the profession, but also help us to address staffing issues in schools serving overwhelmingly historically marginalized children and youth. Pursuing a teaching certificate has additional costs that presents undue hardships. So for instance, internship is a year-long obligation that requires a full-time teaching residency in the second semester, making it virtually impossible for teacher candidates to work. This requirement disproportionately burdens Black and Brown teacher candidates who may have additional financial obligations. It could also strengthen the pipeline by providing funding for youth workers and paraprofessionals already working with young people and who would have to stop working to pursue certification. This legislation would also help to reverse the decline of Black teachers in Black communities, specifically in Baltimore City, where my research is situated, where Black teachers declined from comprising 63% to 38% of BCPSS teachers from 2003 to 2015, according to a Baltimore Teachers Union report. Passing HB 918 would send a strong message that Maryland values the professional expertise of Black and Brown teachers and also signals that we are willing to do what's necessary to invest in the futures of Black and Brown children. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Allen. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Mavis Sanders. Dr. Sanders, thank you for being here.
Thank you very much for allowing me to provide testimony for the House Bill 918. And I want to thank Delegate Ampry for bringing this forward. I just want to emphasize what my colleagues have already said, and there is a diversity gap in schools between teachers and students. It's a national issue, it's a state issue, and HB 918 is an intentional effort to address this gap. Without such intentional effort, what we'll see is the continued gap between teachers and students of color. And we know that when you have teachers of color in the classroom, you have students taking more rigorous courses, you have lower behavioral referrals, you have higher achievement. And I know that's what all of us want here in Maryland schools. This 918, the House Bill 918 allows Maryland to really take a leadership role and ensure that we as a state and as a nation address this diversity gap that's having a negative impact on our children and on our teachers. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sanders. Are there any questions from members of the committee for Dr. Goings, Dr. Allen, or Dr. Sanders? The gentlelady from Anne Arundel County is recognized. Delegate Henson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Delegate Ambry, for bringing this bill and for all the supporters and testifiers for the bill. One of the things that we did at the start of session was overriding the governor's veto to the blueprint for Maryland's future. And one of the important provisions of the blueprint is raising the status of the teacher profession. There's a 10% increase in teacher salary across the board. It raises the starting salary for our teachers to $60,000 as the base salary. And in my mind, that will make the profession of teaching more attractive. And it sounds like this bill will not only make the profession more attractive, but it will make it more attractive for minority populations to come along and teach. So as we have that policy that raises the pay, it looks like we also have some support to bring more minority representation. Do any of the panelists feel like with the salary increasing, this is a good time to have legislation like this, such as the one that Delegate Ampry's introduced?
I think absolutely that's the case. We know that the reason we have this diversity gap between students and teachers is complex, and that one solution is not going to be sufficient. We really have to have an integrated approach. And by raising the professionalism, the pay, and also offsetting some of the cost involved, I think is the right approach. And it'll allow us to make more progress on this issue than we would if it was only one or the other. So I think you're absolutely right that this is the perfect timing for these both.
Thank you for your testimony. Thank you.
Are there any other questions from members of the committee for the panel? Seeing none, thank you very much. That concludes the bill hearing for House Bill 918. Delegate Ampry, great job. Have a great day. Next, we'll move on to House Bill 1056. Delegate Stein, 9 public schools, adequate health services, eligibility for reimbursement. Delegate Stein, thank you very much for being here, and please proceed when you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair and committee members.
So this bill would seek to enhance the delivery of health services to 8 through 12 student population, which would also help address the very important need to contain the spread of COVID-19. The bill would authorize counties to reimburse eligible non-public schools for up to 50% of the cost for adequate health services. It's important to note that this bill is authorizing legislation only. It authorizes a county to reimburse eligible non-public schools for up to half of their costs for adequate health services as defined in COMAR. And similarly, it would be optional for a non-public school to seek reimbursement under the bill. Under state law, in public schools, counties are required to provide these adequate health services, which include a limited set of health services that are usually provided by a school nurse, such as emergency services, health appraisals, et cetera. But these health services also include help with communicable disease control, including the prevention, investigation, limitation, and eradication of diseases caused by infectious agents and usually spread from person to person. And so school nurses are also able to help local health departments monitor communicable diseases and disseminate public health information. And as we know, in the era of COVID, we know how important these functions are. And we also know that we've also learned that contagious viruses such as COVID do not differentiate between public and non-public schools. Viral spread in either setting can lead to spread in the wider community. But, and this is what this bill aims to address, many non-public schools are struggling to find the resources needed to retain nurses. Sometimes if a school doesn't have a nurse, they may have to turn to administrators, teachers, or teachers' aides to provide healthcare advice and rudimentary healthcare services. And this is during a time when students and parents could greatly benefit from the help of school nurses. So this bill specifies the counties may reimburse eligible non-public schools for up to 50% of the cost of a qualified health professional as defined in the bill. And to be eligible, non-public schools must meet several criteria. They have to provide the same adequate health services provided by public schools. They have to comply with the identical non-discrimination commitment found in the existing BOOST program, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, national origin, sexual orientation, or gender identity or expression. And the school has to limit tuition in the same manner as required by the non-public schools textbook and technology grants program. So therefore, any non-public school that seeks reimbursement cannot charge more in tuition than the average cost per pupil in that county. So, Mr. Vice Chair and committee members, I urge support for the bill. Do want to note that there is a technical amendment that I've submitted that corrects the drafting error so that the bill will now reflect the language used in the state budget for current programs serving non-public schools. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Delegate Stein, for presenting House Bill 1056. We also have testimony in favor of this bill, and we'll hear from those testimonies, and then we'll take questions from members of the committee. First, we have favorable oral testimonies, Sam Melamed with Teach Maryland. Mr. Melamed.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Vice Chair and esteemed committee members and sponsor Delegate Stein. I'm Sam Melamed, co-chair of the Teach Maryland Coalition. I'm also here as a dad to our 4 wonderful children, and I'm pleased to speak up strongly in favor of HB 1056. The COVID reality in our communities has highlighted the need for adequate health services to be available to all children in Maryland, and it further demonstrated that the health outcomes of all the state's residents can impact others in our communities, and we have a responsibility to meet those needs. Since the start of COVID, many non-public schools have hired healthcare workers to help coordinate their COVID responses and keep down any community spread. An added benefit has been the ability for these nurses and other healthcare workers to help drive further public health education into the non-public school community. Although some have asserted that this is an unfunded mandate, in fact, passing this law doesn't mandate anything. It will merely allow counties to help out with partial funding for these healthcare workers. It further delegates to the Department of Health the ability to create a framework for the ideal delivery of adequate healthcare services into the non-public school community. The fiscal impact is actually quite a bit more limited than suggested because the bill's means testing significantly limits eligibility to only schools that charge an average tuition below the state's average expenditure per pupil. A vote in favor of House Bill 1056 will encourage better health outcomes among some of the state's most hard-to-reach communities and across COVID, vaccinations, and other desired education and healthcare outcomes. And thank you for your support.
Thank you very much, Mr. Melamed. Next, we'll hear from Ms. Michelle Sheldon Rubio with Cardinal Sheehan School.
Good afternoon, and thank you. I would just like to say, first of all, I'm a registered nurse and been a registered nurse for a very long time, more than 30 years. I'm a full-time nurse at Cardinal Sheehan School. I've been there for over 3 years, from the great 43rd District in Baltimore City. I am a city dweller, as well as I've been educated and worked in Baltimore City all of my career. I chose Cardinal Sheehan School because of mission, and I do agree with HB 1056 because there really is a need to have some reimbursement. Most of our schools, our Catholic schools, are very low. The one that I work is very low tuition. Tuition is about a third of the cost as it is of the education in a public school. And because it's really important for our children to have the same medical coverage and a licensed medical practitioner there, they get a good assessment for what's going on with them at any given time. The parents can feel good about sending their children to our school. I coordinate all kinds of screenings for the children. This year of COVID, I was leading a committee to actually set up to invite our children back in on August 31st. We haven't had really any outbreaks at all. I have a tight bubble there, and our children wear masks and shields. So we're doing very well there. But it would be very helpful in support of HB 1056 so we can get qualified nurses at every non-public school in Baltimore City. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sheldon Rubio. And also we have Mr. Garrett O'Day with the Maryland Catholic Conference.
Hello, Mr. Vice Chair. Thank you. Good to see you. Members of the committee, thanks for hearing this important bill today. We, on behalf of the Catholic Conference, for the record, I'm Garrett O'Day, Deputy Director of Maryland Catholic Conference, and Vice President of Maryland CAPE, our non-public school coalition, which represents the interests of around 1 in every 9 students in Maryland, which are educated in our non-public schools. My counterpart in Maryland CAPE Senate, Rabbi Sadwin, is waiting over in the Senate to testify in support of this bill. We want to thank Delegate Stein and Senators Waldstreicher and Hedelman for bringing this bill on each side. As we always like to remind everybody, most of our students in our non-public schools are low and middle income. I'm here today on behalf of our students educated in our Catholic schools. Many of those schools do not have the budgets, especially in this time, for full-time nursing. Many share school nurses with other schools part-time, and this bill could be a huge help to them, particularly in this time. As Ms. Rubio expressed, Cardinal Sheehan is a perfect example, especially in our Baltimore City schools. So as you know, our Catholic schools, particularly such as the Baltimore City community schools, whose mission it is to serve largely underprivileged, minority, and often non-Catholic students in Baltimore City, have tight budgets and dedicate much of their additional resources toward direct assistance to their students. A 50% county reimbursement would really go a long way in caring for these students. So the COVID pandemic has really affected the communities where we serve, especially our Latino students heavily concentrated in Baltimore City and Montgomery counties, as well as 4 Catholic schools statewide that have closed their doors due to the pandemic. So these students in schools really need the assistance like this bill would provide more than ever, and we respectfully request that you report favorably on this bill.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions from members of the Appropriations Committee to the bill sponsor and to the witnesses? Seeing none, we also have testimony, written testimony in the bill packet from JCRC, Baltimore Jewish Council, Ogdoth Israel of Maryland, and MD Cape, Maryland Association of Counties, and the Maryland Education Coalition. That ends the bill hearing for House Bill 1056. Thank you very much for being here. The committee will now move to House Bill 1300, Delegate Smith, Income Tax 529, College Investment Plans, Elementary and Secondary Education Expenses. Delegate Smith, thank you for being here, and please proceed when you're ready. Delegate Smith, if you could please unmute yourself.
That would be helpful. I apologize, Mr. Chair. I'm doing this via my cell phone because I have to have another meeting lined up. So I just want to apologize for the platform. For the record, Delegate Stephanie Smith, here to present House Bill 1300. This is just a very, direct bill. Under the 2017 tax bill, there were some provisions included at the behest of Senator Ted Cruz to hasten forth more private school choice by enabling people who have 529 accounts, which were conceived to be a remedy for college inaffordability and to help people to better, promote planning for college expenses. It expanded the appropriate use for that for, kindergarten through 12th grade private education. So people can use 529 plans now for those expenses up to $10,000, as well as they're eligible in the state of Maryland for various deductions related to their 529 account. So what my bill would do is it would prohibit an individual from claiming the subtraction modification for contributions made to their Maryland college investment plan, and also would prevent those funds, if they're being used for elementary or secondary education expenses, for them to also use that income distribution to, there's basically a provision in my bill that would require them, if they use these funds for elementary through high school, private school expenses, they would have to add back to their income distribution form what was spent on that was not a collegiate expense. One of the reasons why I think this is important is that whenever you're giving some type of tax break to encourage a set of behavior modification, there needs to be a relationship. I was looking at a Brookings Institution report on this when it was first established. Obviously, it's a pretty new benefit. And they noted that roughly 47% of all 529 households are households that have incomes of roughly $150,000 and above. So we're talking about, in many ways, affluent households essentially using the 529 tax structure to finance education they would otherwise be obtaining or currently already obtaining for their children. So from my perspective, I believe it's a better use of the Maryland system under the 529 to retain, at least from the state component, the integrity of it being focused on collegiate expenses and related expenses. So for that reason, I really would beg of the committee to give careful consideration to this bill, and also to just think if this is the direction we want to go as a state, and essentially helping to use our tax system to enable folks to pay for private education when that wasn't really the legislative intent and the conception of our 529 plan. So I do not want to belabor that point. I want to thank you for the opportunity to be before your committee today. I know it's been a long day, and I do wish a favorable report for House Bill 1300. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Delegate Smith. And if the committee, if we could, we're going to hear favorable testimony from 2 witnesses, and then we'll take questions. First witness we have is Kaylee Shumitz with the Maryland Center on Economic Policy.
Thank you, Vice Chair Chang, members of the committee. Again, my name is Callie Shumitz with the Maryland Center on Economic Policy, here in support of House Bill 1300. As Delegate Smith explained, the 2017 federal tax overhaul fundamentally changed the purpose of 529 plans. They were originally conceived both at the federal and state level as a way to help families pay for the increasingly unaffordable price of higher education. Maryland, along with many other states, has chosen to provide additional tax breaks for 529 plan savings on top of the subsidies in federal law to help families. But because of the change in 2017, those tax breaks are now eligible for expenses and tuition to enrollment in private schools. This year's fiscal note does not include a cost estimate, but the prior year's fiscal note estimated the cost of the state to be about $20 million per year. And this is money that's primarily going to higher income taxpayers who don't need the state support to be able to afford private elementary and secondary school, which reinforces existing economic inequities. So we don't think that that is the best use of state dollars. So for that reason, we think it's better to ensure that we're reserving scarce state resources for more important community priorities and investing in our public schools. So we'd ask for a favorable report on House Bill 1300.
Thank you very much, Ms. Shumitz. Next, we'll hear from Ms. Samantha Zwirling with the Maryland State Education Association.
Great. Thank you so much. Good afternoon. My name is Samantha Zwirling, and I serve in a government relations role for the Maryland State Education Association, representing 75,000 educators across the state. Thank you to the chair and the vice chair and members of the committee for allowing me to testify. MSEA is here in support of House Bill 1300, which establishes these reporting requirements for 529 plans, as well as forbidding tax benefits for funds withdrawn from a state 529 plan for K through 12 expenses. This bill would end this unintended voucher program created in the state college savings plan by changes in the federal law, as you've heard already from the other two witnesses and the sponsor. I'll just say that this plan, the Maryland plan and the associated benefits were set up by the legislature with the intent of helping Marylanders save for college. And, you know, Governor Hogan in a press release in 2018 described the program as designed to help families, especially those from low income and middle income households, have the opportunity to start saving for college for their children. The establishment of this program was a policy decision that Marylanders and that Maryland lawmakers made. So this program unfortunately changed due to the federal changes in the federal tax law. As Callie just noted, last year, this bill, the Fiscal Note, estimated this was costing around $32 million to state and local entities. So I'll just also finish by noting that there have been many conversations for years in this body around the BOOST program and whether or not to continue that voucher program, which was intentionally set up by this General Assembly. While MSEA opposes the program, the BOOST program at least has guardrails regarding income limits and a stated goal of the program. So this loophole was an unintentional without any guardrails, and it's costing the state around 3 times as much as the BOOST program does. For all those reasons, MSEA urges a favorable report on House Bill 1300. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions from members of the committee for the bill sponsor or the witnesses? Seeing none, that ends the hearing for House